Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 8th meeting of Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I've received apologies from Ruth Maguire this morning, so can I welcome Rona Mackay, who is attending as a committee substitute. The first agenda item is to decide whether or not to take item 3 in private. Item 3 will be a discussion about the evidence that we're going to hear today. Are the committee in agreement to taking that in private? I'm grateful. Our second agenda item relates to the committee effectiveness inquiry that we are undertaking. Our inquiry is seeking to answer the question, are there changes to the Parliament's procedures and practices which would help committees to work more effectively? We have taken evidence from a wide range of witnesses, providing both practice and academic expertise on committee operation. We held a facilitated discussion with the conveners group, and we've also gathered written views via public call for views and from other legislatures, parties and committees. Today is an opportunity for the committee to explore with the political parties and then indeed the Scottish Government its and their views on a range of themes and issues that have been raised during the course of our inquiry, and to help inform our conclusions and the recommendations in our report. And we are also joined this morning by our committee advisor, Dr Daniel Bezic. Good morning. I would also like to welcome today Douglas Ross, MSP from the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, Willie Rennie, MSP, representing the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Ross Greer, MSP, Scottish Green Party, Karen Adam, MSP, representing the Scottish National Party, Rhoda Grant, MSP, Scottish Labour Party, and Ash Regan, MSP, representing the Alba Party. Good morning. I'm keen to emphasise that we are seeking from witnesses this morning their party's views on the questions that we'll pose to them. And also, given that this is a large panel, I'm keen, wherever possible, that both questions and answers are concise, and that may be one of the recommendations from this committee inquiry. So I'm going to throw you all straight into the den and hand you over to Rona, who has some questions to ask. But good morning.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. It's lovely we've got all parties represented here today, and I'm going to start with what might seem like a wee bit of a trick question and ask you to sum up the role of committees in 1 or 2 sentences. If you could do that to start, please. I'll start with Douglas and go ahead.
Well, I'll try and take the Chair's advice and yours for 1 and 2 sentences. I think we are here to clearly scrutinise government legislation. We are here to scrutinise government ministers, and we're also here as committees to look at the topical issues of the day. And I think if we do all those 3 things, then we will perform well as committees.
Thank you. Willie?
I agree with Douglas.
That was short.
I don't think there's much more to add. I think Douglas has summarised it quite well. The only other point I would make is the issues that members can be elected here with a particular interest in that may not appear to be the issue of the day, may not look like a topical issue at the time, but members elected here are aware of a particular topic and can bring that into the committee work planning process, can suggest it as an inquiry, etc. That has in the past led to some really effective inquiries that have resulted in change. So I don't think that is more important than legislative scrutiny, for example, but being able to bring topics to the table that are not necessarily on Reporting Scotland the night before is also a really important part of the role.
Okay, thank you. Karen?
Thank you. I would say we're here to uphold democracy and be the voice of the people that elected us to come here, and that includes scrutinising the government and making good law, but that scrutiny doesn't stop at one bill being presented at stage 1. It's an ongoing process, and I would say that all law and all democracy is a living entity that we have to continually scrutinise to make it the best we can be, and that's our job here in the Parliament and at committees, is to uphold that, and that's our duty.
Thanks, Karen. Rhoda?
I agree with what everybody else said. Just 2 points I would add. I think committees have the position to take a deep dive into issues that might not be topical but might be important. And the other thing, which I think this committee is interested in, is post-legislative scrutiny. I think committees have a role in looking back and seeing how things worked.
Okay, thank you. Ash?
Yes, that's what I was going to add. In addition to what Douglas said, was I think post-legislative scrutiny is something that we could and should be doing better as a Parliament. And the other thing that I would add, which wasn't something that I was particularly aware of myself, but I've just started sitting on the supported bodies, like it's an extra committee that's just, it's a short life committee. And it's very much come out during that MSPs and committees are actually responsible for monitoring the performance of the bodies that are supported and funded by the corporate body of the Parliament. And I think it's the case that MSPs and committees are possibly not aware of that and are certainly not exercising that as they should be.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask you what your party's views are on the performance of our committees currently. Douglas.
We might not all agree on this one. I think it's quite clear in our submission that we think there is a lot of good work done in committees, but the performance could be better, and some of our suggestions, if we want to get into some of that, are aimed at improving the effectiveness of the committees. We might get onto it later, and if others are planning to ask this, but we look at the DeHont system for allocating members. We think it would perform better if the inbuilt government majority is removed. Therefore, you get better cross-party working within committees. On Ash's point about post-legislative scrutiny, we believe that the change from a couple of parliaments ago for that to come into the subject committees was for very good reason, because you have expertise within those committees to do that post-legislative scrutiny. But because of the workload of most of our committees, that is now not getting the attention that it should. Therefore, in our submission, we are saying we should go back to a standalone committee looking at post-legislative scrutiny. And finally, maybe on effectiveness, we believe the size of some committees is too big, and I would include my own committee, which I convene in education, with two excellent members who are with me today, so I'm not trying to get rid of them, but Mr Rennie and Mr Greer are members, and Ms Webber chaired that committee. When you have a 10-member committee and a panel of 4 or 5, it can be very difficult to get through your sessions on time, as I proved yesterday when we went about an hour and a half over. So we believe that all committees should be either 7 or 5, and that would allow far more focused questions from the committees.
Okay, thank you. Willie.
So, I mean, we've had the benefit, I think Ross and I are the only 2 members, the original members of the Education Committee. So we've seen with different, and it has rotated a lot. I mean, I think far too much. And I know that's up to the parties, but I think you lose knowledge. And actually the team that's created, I think, goes as well. So I would try and appeal to the whips not to rotate as frequently. When we did the Children, Care and Justice Bill, the 3 members of the SNP, and it's not casting any aspersions on the existing SNP members, but they really were prepared to step out and not vote with the whip and test the government minister in a way that I thought was the best of a committee. And they weren't being rebellious, they were just doing the right thing to press. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes we see people just with a whip in front of them and they just vote every single time exactly the same way and don't question anything. So I've seen both ends of the extreme. So my point is that I think a lot of this is down to the individuals. The structure does have an impact. It does incentivise different behaviours. But unless you've got the culture that's right, that's collaborative, that's prepared to test and challenge from government members, then you're going to get a bit of a stultifying experience where you just don't really move anything further forward. And you see when the members do that, ministers are forced to engage more effectively, and I think they do a better job as a result. And I think we ended up with a better bill through that Children, Care and Justice Bill as a result of those members just behaving differently. So I think we do need some structural reform, but my appeal really is for government members to see the benefit of just straying a little bit from the whip and straying into challenge rather than just adhering to what they're told. So that's my only advice.
Okay, thank you. Ross.
Yeah, very much agree with that. What I would add to Willie's point around the rotation or turnover of members on committees is I think that can exacerbate one of the problems that we highlighted, or what we see as a problem that we highlighted in our submission around spice questions. If members have only been on a committee for a short period of time and are going to be off of it within a couple of months, there is less incentive to become familiar with the topic at hand, and I don't think it's effective scrutiny to turn up, read 2 spice questions, switch off, do your emails, and then leave for another week. What we want as part of the committee process, and as Rhoda said, committees are the opportunity to really dive deep into an issue. The spice questions are there as a broad guide. Too often that they are just used as a script, and they will get a scripted answer in response, particularly if it's from a government minister, but also for quite understandable reasons. When we have non-government witnesses come to committees, they are given a pretty good idea of the specific questions that they're going to be asked, because we want them to feel comfortable in the setting. But that does then result in scripted answer, scripted question, and I'm not convinced that that's particularly effective scrutiny. And I've been on committees where very high-quality spice papers are prepared, but at the convener's decision there are no questions provided as part of that. It's up to members based on the spice briefing to decide what they want to talk about, and I think that improves committee effectiveness. The other point I would make, just based on the fact I think that there is a very clear consensus around post-legislative scrutiny and the fact that we don't do enough of it, is about the full parliamentary session. The first half of a parliament is often spent doing topical inquiries into whatever the areas of interest are for the various members of a committee, and then the second half is spent in an incredibly pressured legislative timetable, very often bill after bill after bill, and no space to do topical or reactive work. Part of that is because there's not really that strong steer at the start of a parliament to say, well, there are not going to be many bills coming forward in the first couple of years. This is the opportunity to do post-legislative work, particularly looking at everything the previous session has passed and that has had a couple of years to bed in. And I think there's maybe something there in terms of the guidance that we give to individual members, particularly new members as part of their induction, but also to committees at the start when they do that first work planning session in the recess period after an election. There's probably not a rigid structure that we can build in there, and it should always be up to each individual committee, and I think a lot of discretion should be given to conveners. But there should probably be a bit more guidance in terms of, well, here's what you can realistically achieve over a parliamentary session. Bear in mind that in the second half, you're going to be able to do far less of what you want, and your work is going to be largely dictated by the legislation coming forward, and therefore plan in the first half to do all the other work that we collectively agree is necessary, but is not happening at present.
Thank you. I mean, that's going to be covered in later questions, but thank you. Karen.
I would disagree on the removal of any system that undermines the democratic representation that the people have elected to represent them within the Parliament and within the committees scrutinising that legislation. I think that's important that we have that proportionate representation within our committees. The point of continuity, absolutely, that is helpful, and it does work when you have people that have been there for a long time. Myself, I've been on the Qualities Committee from the beginning, and now I'm convener, and it has been really helpful in that regard. But also, I would say having a fresh pair of eyes isn't harmful. You know, people can come in with fresh perspectives, and particularly if there's a bill upcoming for a piece of work on a committee and that person has some lived experience or background there. So I do think that should be up to the individual groups, because they're the people that know each other the best. They know each other's talents and backgrounds, and I think that can be quite an intuitive process. I think it's down to each individual member how they work on the committee, and I think, you know, the SNP party have a very deep respect for the Scottish Parliament. It is really within our interests that we have robust scrutiny to make good law for the people in Scotland, because ultimately that makes good, robust governance. So for us, it would be a case of training and support for all individual members on committees to know how to do that robust scrutiny as effective as possible. In terms of, I just want to plug that on the Qualities Committee, actually putting that on, we are doing a bit of post-legislative scrutiny on the BSL Act, and we also looking at the implementation of acts and the delay on that, on FGM, for example. So I think it's working together with your work programme with other members to see how you can work that in. But again, it's down to individual people and what's happening at that moment. Topical things arise, you have to make space for that, absolutely. I would say that on committee, as time has gone on and looking at committees from the past, from maybe years ago, social media has played a big part in how committees and I suppose overall Parliament run people sometimes want clips for social media. The politicisation of certain topics may not help. So I think in that regard it's important that we have that robust training for members for going on committees so that they know and understand how important and respectful they should be when they're scrutinising legislation.
Thank you. Thanks. Rhoda?
I agree with a lot of what's been said, so I'm not going to go rehash it. I think it's important for committees to work together. I think you need to kind of form that bond within the committee so people almost can fill in behind each other and understand, and some of that is because of spice briefings and the like, but to work together to really scrutinise and dive down into the information. I know when the Parliament was first set up, it was impressed on people that when they went into committee, they left their party affiliation outside and they followed the evidence, and I think that is really important, and that then binds the committee together a bit tighter to work together. I think we would favour maybe a wee bit more flexibility around committees. If we need to set up additional committees, then we should do that, subcommittees, reporters, to make sure that there is enough there to support the work that needs to be done. Smaller committees as well, which I know some people can be on 3 committees. It's very difficult to get across all the information you need for 3 committees. So smaller committees tend to work better together. They seem to get to the issues faster. But also, if there is a committee that is overloaded, and that's happening quite a lot as you come to the end of the term, why not set up other committees to take specific bits of work and deal with it? So just we shouldn't cut back and restrict what we do. We need to scrutinise.
Okay, thanks, Rhoda. Ash?
I'd agree with much of what's been said already by colleagues. I think the performance of committees can be excellent. There's some really good pieces of work that have been carried out by this committee. If I think about inquiries, and I was on the other end of this because I was a minister of the time, I think it was the Public Audit Committee in the last session. It was about dangerous dogs. It was very hard-hitting. You know, it had a big level of buy-in from the public and had a good impact there. But generally speaking, it seems to me, and I've obviously been on a bit of a journey through this Parliament, and I have actually sat on 8 committees myself, so I've seen both sides, and obviously in different political parties, so I've possibly got a slightly different view on things than I may have had previously. That it seems that there's a strong correlation between a strong-minded independent convener and the performance of the committee. And I think we can see that in this session as well. There are some committees that are standing out as doing excellent work, holding the government to account, and there are others that are not. You know, we have had some examples of very poor practice in committees, and I would say the Equality Committee in this session has failed. If we look at the GRR bill and the scrutiny that took place there, my view is that the committee did fail in its scrutiny there. I can go into more on that, but this might not be the appropriate question, so I can perhaps come back to it, convener, if that's useful to the committee. But the Parliament does delegate. You know, we're all very busy, and the Parliament as a whole does delegate the responsibility for scrutinising, particularly on important pieces of legislation, to that subject committee. And if the Parliament doesn't feel confident that that scrutiny has been carried out effectively, you know, there is an opportunity there, I think, and I believe that was the case in that instance, where the reputation of the Parliament was tarnished, both within and, you know, to the public outside. So I think we need to have a better way of assessing things, where we go back and look, did this work? If it didn't work, how do we make sure that we don't have these kind of things happening again? And I agree with some of the comments being made about committees being smaller. The committee that I'm sitting on at the moment, many of our witnesses have said that capacity is an issue, that, you know, this is the commissioners, you know, they're doing important work, they're writing reports that the public are paying for, that the public, you know, would have an impact on the public life of Scotland. And yet they're saying, you know, no committee has scrutinised this report, they haven't called us in to talk about it. So I think the way to address that is to have less people on committees. And that committee that I'm sitting on has 5 on it, which is considered to be quite small. It's working very effectively. None of us really knew each other before, but we're just getting stuck into it. So I would agree with what Rhoda said on that. And I also think that, you know, when I was in the SNP, at one point I was on 3 committees. I don't think anybody in this Parliament should be sitting on 3 committees. It's far too many.
Can I interject? I agree with you. I agree with you. The practicalities are that has to happen because of the lack of backbenchers that we have.
It's just my opinion. You can
Yeah,
take it
no,
or
no,
leave it.
I'm just saying that
Yeah.
I agree with you, but it's not possible for some people
it
not
would be
to
if
sit
we
in
had
three
less
committees.
people in each committee. That's the point I'm making. So if we cut the numbers down and we didn't have such big committees, then potentially there would be an opportunity for people not to have to sit on so many. I believe it's such an important role. I think we would all agree with that. I don't think you're able to give it the commitment and the level of attention if you're on three. Probably even if you're on two very big ones as well. That's just my experience. And I also think we should be looking at perhaps having elected conveners. And if you look at the
Sorry, Ash,
work,
we're going to be covering
sure.
that, and those were really helpful answers from everybody, and a lot of what was said is going to be fleshed out in later answers. My next question sort of touches on something that Ross was saying. In other parliaments, having the role of committees is clearly defined at the outset, and it's described as being a good way to support effectiveness. So do you think we should have that here? Do you think that there should be more definition of the committee system for new members and old coming to the committees?
Yeah,
Sorry, Douglas, can I start with you? Yeah, we're just going to go around again.
Yes, and obviously I came back into this Parliament in 2021 as the leader of a party with some very new MSPs, and it was one of the things I was keen as a party that we provided support, because yes, we do a lot in the Chamber, and the Parliament does a lot to ensure you can deliver a speech in the Chamber, but I feel we as individual parties should prioritise committee scrutiny, because the work that we do in these committees is as important as in the Chamber. So I think from the very beginning, yes, there is an onus on both the Parliament and the individual parties to do that. If I could just quickly pick up on a couple of points as well. On Ash's point about members being on more than one committee, again going back to education, we have a number of members who are on two big committees, education and finance, and actually I think both Ross Greer and John Mason aid our discussions in education with some of the experience they bring from the finance committee. So it can be useful, but I don't take away from what was said about the workload. And secondly, perhaps understandably this morning we've spoken a lot about scrutiny of the government. I think there's an awful lot we can do as committees of scrutinising outside bodies, and in fact probably one of the most high-profile sessions we had in the Education Committee was what was going to be a free week. Our clerks had, had an issue with other witnesses and were going to give time off. I said, no, let's make sure we meet every week. And we called in Dundee University. And we got answers for people working and students at Dundee University because, as a committee, we were able to scrutinise the interim principal and his fellow court. But we also invited the local members, so I think we've got to also understand that committee is important for the members who sit on it every week, but actually there will be issues that are important for regional or local members that they can come along and take part in. And going back to what you were asking, if members know at the start of a term, you're not just confined to only going to your own committee. There are areas of interest at Audit Committee, at Petitions Committee, at this committee that you can ask to go along to. Then hopefully that will increase the breadth of knowledge across Parliament.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Willie.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I didn't really sit on a committee for 10 years when I was leader. I think it was the Calman Powers bill that was coming through. I sat on that initially, but I didn't sit for the rest of the time. So it was a kind of an untapped world for me, which I've enjoyed since, actually. The Education Committee has been, for the reasons that Douglas set out, you're able to get into kind of the level of detail you would never in the chamber, and you get witnesses before you that know an awful lot of stuff, and you can gain tremendous knowledge by listening and reading the briefings and getting the knowledge from Spice, which I think helps you do the rest of your work. So I think committees really need to be emphasised at the start of the term. Smaller committees, I would be in favour of. There is an issue about proportionality, and I think if we're going smaller, I think the other parties need to recognise that the very small parties can't be cut out altogether. We need to be able to have a proportionate space overall across the committees. But I'm for smaller ones because I think you get much more agile, nimble committees that are able to really get under the bonnet of important issues. My third point is, when I was in the House of Commons for 4 years and I sat on the Defence Committee for a period, and because that was a select committee rather than a standing committee for legislation, the Labour members, and it was a Labour government majority at the time, they left their rosettes at the door, and we were able to give ministers a really hard time And they didn't get pressure, I understand, from their whips for doing so because they regarded that as their job. And that separation of legislation from scrutiny of accountability is actually a benefit of the Westminster system. I know we can't do that here. But being able to get in members' minds that they have two functions that are separate. When you're scrutinising legislation, we know the legislation from a government perspective has got to get through. That's their job, is to vote it through. But when it comes to the scrutiny of bodies and ministers, they need to act differently. So having two kind of committee structures and roles in their head, I think would be an important thing.
Can I just come in on that point? Partly because I'm going to remind people very early in this committee meeting that I am very conscious of time. But to address the point that you're raising there, Willie, about the separation in other parliaments between the legislative scrutiny and the inquiry scrutiny, do you think it would be possible for the same members but to be sitting with two different hats and two different committees? So in essence, a committee here could sit as a legislative committee, where there would be one view, but then separately and distinctly it could sit as an inquiry committee. It could be the same people, could be in the same room, could be at the same relevant time. But if there was a different role identified for those different parts, might that aid what you're talking about of either leaving hat, rosette, club at the door?
Yeah, I've never thought of that as a suggestion, but it's actually quite a good one. You could have it could be exactly the same people, because you want that knowledge that's been gleaned through the pre-legislative scrutiny as well to be included in the questioning and the scrutiny of the legislation, but also from your other inquiries. So you could have exactly the same membership, but you call it something different on a particular day you're doing legislation. I think that could work as a suggestion. So yes, I would be sympathetic to that. Okay. The only other one thing is I'm interested in this non-government majority because I think it would force us, opposition members on a committee, to behave differently ourselves. And we would know that actually how we voted would affect the outcome of the vote. And you couldn't just sit in isolation knowing that you can vote a certain way and having no effect on the outcome. I think the balance of responsibility shifts. And when it comes to legislation, the government can always clear it up when it gets to stage 3 in the chamber, if they're unhappy with something that's come forward. I think it could force greater collaboration between opposition and government, because we would know. I mean, take for instance, since the Greens have left government, the Parliament's changed. Ministers are much more engaging. And they're trying, you can see them work in the chamber and work in the tea rooms now. Not having that majority, I think, forces ministers to look outwards. That might be the same on committees.
Okay, thanks. Ross.
Yeah, just on Willie's last point there, a government without a majority is forced to look outward within Parliament. The counter-argument I would make to that, not that I'm complaining, I think it is good that the government has to work with other parties in Parliament, is certainly my experience from when our party was in government was the government having a stable majority, yes, gave less incentive to look around Parliament for broader support. Conversely, what that did was it gave the government more time to engage outside of Parliament with other people. There was less time needing spent on winning votes in Parliament. More time could be spent engaging with other key stakeholders in society. So there's an argument there about Parliament obviously has an absolutely critical role, but it's not the only stakeholder for government. So there's a little bit of a counter-argument. But just on committee size, I agree with Willie on this issue of proportionality, not to predict the next election result, but if you look at polling at the moment, there will be 6 parties in this Parliament next session, of which none could have fewer than 10 MSPs. So I think there's a challenge there of setting up a committee system of smaller committees whilst maintaining a degree of proportionality, going to Karen's point, because the further that we would diverge from the result of the election, the more uncomfortable I would get. Committees are never going to be a perfect mirroring of election results just because of size. But if we are trying to engineer something that moves even further away from that, I think we lose democratic legitimacy there. So we need to balance the two. I do think, though, in purely practical terms, there is a clear argument for not just smaller committees, but more smaller committees. If we're going to have smaller committees, I think we should have a few more committees. Justice is the one area where that has happened repeatedly in the past, where we've needed multiple committees to cover justice. Sometimes just called Justice Committee 1, Justice Committee 2. This session we've distinguished between criminal and civil, which I think is probably a more useful distinction. But there's definitely a lot more to do. But we've diverged quite far from the question that you asked, Rona. So
I'm just going to ask people to be as brief as possible. We've got loads to get through.
Yeah, so just very briefly on that. In terms of defining committee roles, I think there's a lot more we could do at the start of the session, both in terms of how we define the committee role, but also in the new member induction. So we saw recently with the OECD review of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the clear recommendation they gave for more training for all members of Parliament on issues of financial scrutiny, because that's certainly an issue we felt on the Finance Committee, that members on other committees realise that the financial issues around most of what we deal with here are difficult, but it's fine, don't worry, there'll be a financial memorandum, the Finance Committee will deal with that. What we want is for every committee to be a Finance Committee.
That's a good point, thank you. I'm going to move on to Karen, thank you.
Yeah, on to the point of induction and training and that experience that people can bring to committees as well. I think there's a part to play for political parties prior to coming to the Scottish Parliament and being elected. And I think that education begins with vetting and when candidates are in place as well. That understanding of how our democratic institution works is beneficial to all of society anyway. But having that basic knowledge before people get here in the first place is really important. Induction and training and ongoing professional development as well is very helpful. Oftentimes, if you are looking at a bill that's maybe taken up a good few weeks and then you're stepping into doing a bit of post-ledge scrutiny, for example, then your hat does change a bit there and you have to shift focus again. So ongoing skills development is really helpful for everybody on committee. I would say that emotional intelligence is really important, and I think knowing how to recognise the effectiveness of respectful scrutiny, and that's how you get the best from the witnesses as well. So a whole rounded approach to training, induction, ongoing, I think is really important to have the most effective committees.
Okay. Thank you. Rhoda?
I won't repeat what others have said. Just to say, I think every MSP needs an overview of training when they come, and that has to have the role of the committees on it. But I think within committees there's been some really successful training, like questioning training, where the committees work together and learn questioning techniques, and that could be done as well at the start of a session about deeper dives into subject areas that people will be involved in, but maybe only have a passing knowledge of. It's the only role in the world that continuous professional development doesn't seem to count, but I suppose every day is a school day for us.
Okay, thank you. Ash?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a role for setting out to new members when they come in about what the function and remit of a committee is in the Parliament, just to make sure everyone's clear about what they're here to do. It's a while since I first arrived, so it's about 9 years ago now, but I also remember the question training that we got in 2016, which I thought was useful. And I think that was when the Parliament first started to do an induction programme, and I believe they might have updated it since for 2021. I don't know how successful that was. But I wonder, when we're talking about CPD, I think there is maybe an opportunity for that, because I think sometimes when you first come in, maybe it's worthwhile maybe refreshing certain skills. And if we're talking about questioning training, it would appear to me that some members did not get the memo on the training from then, because it was more about being succinct and getting to the point, whereas there's a lot, as we all know, there's a lot of waffling going on.
Okay, thanks. Great. Those answers touched on a lot of, further questions, and I had further ones. I'm not going to ask them in the interest of time, but I am going to pose a challenge, and it will be a challenge in the last question. A one-word answer, please. Should there be more committee time built into the weekly calendar?
Yes.
Willie?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
No. I think if you make them smaller, you can get more capacity that way.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Excellent. Thank you, Rona. I'm going to ask very closed questions. So there were from question training. I want to look at the role of conveners. And there is an exciting question coming, which will be the third one. But the first one is, how do your parties choose your convener nominations? Ash, if I can come to you first in a sense, because you're in a unique position about it, so you possibly have the opportunity of how should parties choose their conveners, and then I'll come to the other members.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm going to be good at this one, because my experience on that would be based on what I saw in the SNP. And I think how parties should do it is they should obviously choose someone they think is going to be effective, independent-minded and do a good job. I'm not sure that's always the case.
Okay. Rhoda, how's it chosen in Scottish Labour?
Business manager in conjunction with the leader.
Okay. Karen?
There's ongoing discussions with the leadership of the party into who would be most effective, and I think that is just an ongoing scrutiny of all members within our group and party, and what is happening at the time as well. And I've never been in that position to make that decision,
no.
And I can only surmise what's going through their minds when they're making those decisions. But I think it's an important point that there are varying views, that there are varying people making that decision as well, and it's not just a one person that's deciding.
Thank you. Ross?
So we would try to match up the individual in our group who we think kind of best suits that portfolio, but the reality is for the smaller parties, the single most important factor is timetabling workload capacity. So for us, on a Tuesday, for example, when we were in government, so 7 Greens, 2 in government, so only 5 of us that can sit on committees. Of the committees allocated to us, 5 sat on a Tuesday. So all of us had to be on a committee on a Tuesday. And if anybody was ever unavailable, the substitute had to miss their own committee meeting to, for example, do a stage 2, which you really can't miss. So for us, the challenge with that was the committee that, so this session, we were allocated the local government committee to convene. The single most important factor in deciding who our convener was looking at the timetable of when all the committees met and who was actually available at that time. But it's not just committees, it's the other responsibilities as well that fall disproportionately on smaller parties. And I'm not complaining, but for example, the 4 largest parties in this Parliament in each session have to nominate members to sit on a whole range of other bodies, the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, the Parliamentary Pensions Board, whose title I've just got wrong, and a whole range of other bodies that are not parliamentary committees, but that parliamentarians have to sit on. That's fine if you're choosing from 20, 30, 40, 50 people. We have to choose from 7. And so last session, 6 of us at one point were sitting on 13 committees, and I think 9 other bodies.
So in essence, the architecture is defining who can sit on it for your party,
our options
rather
are extremely limited. It's often effectively not a choice, really.
Yeah, we don't have a convener, and actually we decided not to sit on as many committees. We took a different approach from the Greens and decided to focus on areas that we regarded as a priority. And that means we are missing out on certain opportunities, but we don't have a convener. We've got a deputy convener, and that was who happened to be on that committee. But I think it's probably not as a priority as choosing the convener.
Douglas?
Could I come to that bit? Answer another question that you've not asked, but it is a role that the parties have in terms of which committees, because I think it is something that is important, and it's something I spent quite a lot of time on as the leader after 2021, that we had 4 committees that we were going to get through the D'Hondt system, but you put in a pecking order. And the number 1 I asked for was education, which I've now gone full circle and convened myself, because I felt education was going to be the big topic of this Parliament. It was something that I didn't think had had enough scrutiny up until that point. So I think there are discussions about who will be the conveners, but also which committees each respective party would like to get. In terms of the election of the conveners, I also took the decision to have no new MSPs who had been elected for the first time being conveners at the start of the Parliament. I felt it would be unfair for a new MSP to have that additional burden while they were learning the ropes, and I tried to match up people who had an interest, so people who had previous experience as maybe a shadow cabinet secretary in net zero, know, went into the Net Zero Committee. And we did spend quite a bit of time. It didn't always work out because some people I asked to be conveners declined because they did not feel that was the right role for them. And I think 4 years on, they probably regret that now. So it was a decision solely for the leader and the Chief Whip, but trying to match the right people into the right jobs, because I personally believe it is important that we do get the right people in these roles.
It's nice to lift the lid on the dark actions that happen behind the scenes. And that really brings me to, well, actually, just before I go that, and although this committee inquiry is not specifically looking at the distribution of committees and that choice that happens right at the start, just be interesting, you mentioned education. I mean, Willie, what's the most important committee from the Scottish Liberal Democrats' point of view, do you think?
So you'll have seen that we are on rural education. Jamie Green's on public audit. But that's all we have.
But which do you think is the most important committee?
Well, I think education is, because I'm on it.
Ross?
Having been on the Education Committee for now 9 years, I would say that. I think my party's position would be, as you would expect, the Net Zero Committee is the most important for us.
Okay. Karen?
I would say it's really hard to prioritise things that are all a priority, and that's
Yes.
why the committees are set up. But I would say that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee is an exceptionally important committee because it overarches and goes through each of those priorities. Yeah. We've seen things on our desk at committee that would sit with education, would sit with health, would sit with criminal justice, and it does overarch everything, particular scrutiny on human rights budgeting. When we really look at that and how budgeting works, having people with lived experience come into committee and give evidence on, what that looks like for them is exceptionally powerful, and it reaches through every part of their lives.
So it's in essence the value of the fact that what comes before your committee actually covers a whole load of both priorities, but also some of the subject matters that other committees deal with. That sort of overarching part gives it its importance.
Yes, and I would say as well, something that has had particular focus over the last 4 years of scrutiny at committee is the aspect of rurality. And how that does impede a person's access to any type of a public service and their human rights. So where some people may think the Equalities Committee and the Rural Committee are quite, very different in what they may look at in terms of subjects, actually it's that it overarches rurality as well.
Rhoda, Scottish Labour, most important committee?
Somewhere between health and economy, I think, is the more important for us. But just while we're talking about committees and how they run, I think public audit has always not had a majority of government members on it, and I think that's really important because that's one of the real scrutiny committees that everyone has to leave their political affiliation at the door, because we have to make sure that government is properly scrutinised. So while it may appear like a dull backroom committee to an extent, and maybe I'm speaking for myself when I say that, just in case I get into trouble, but I think it is important that that stays totally independent. But certainly for us, health and the economy are the two important things.
Ash?
I'd agree with what Rhoda said there on public audit. I think that's a key committee. I mean, obviously all the committees are important, but I think it generally considered to be sort of the big ones would be, finance, health, education, and justice. But I would say perhaps there is a role here to set up a post-ledge committee, and then that probably should be seen as one of the most important ones.
That's good. I'm going to go back to the topic really of my set of questions, which is about conveners and whether or not there would be an advantage to electing conveners. So I'm very foolishly going to put two parts to my closed question, but I'd like closed answers on it. The first is that simple one, that would there be an additional value to a convener if they were elected by the Chamber? That does not mean altering which party chooses and the discussions that you raised, Douglas, about the setting up, but just the mechanics of being elected by the Chamber rather than it being, I'll put the lid back down on the dark boss about how they're chosen at the moment. Would that give them an enhanced value would it give them an enhanced power? And would it assist us, now a three-part question, would it assist with that cohesion around a committee for members of the committee and the convener to know that they're there because of an election that was open to, I'll just use the word chamber at the moment. Does anyone want to kick off rather than just constantly going around the same line? I'm happy. You want to see, they all put their heads down. This is like some primary school.
It's going the same way, so I didn't want to kick
go
off. And so you asked 3 points, and I would say no, no, and no.
Right.
Just to expand slightly, we make it clear that we could only support elected conveners with the fundamental change of removing the government inbuilt majority in terms of making up the committee membership. So we don't think you could only do elected conveners. We think it would have to be in tandem with further changes.
But in relation to being elected,
so this is what I was going to come on to. First of all, as Ross has suggested, no one is predicting the next election, but we could have a number of smaller parties. Therefore, if we introduce elected conveners, it could be that the Parliament is electing from a choice of one, because some conveners will be from smaller parties who only have one member on the committee. And the reason I quite confidently say no, no and no to your 3 questions is because I had some fears coming into a committee that I had no experience on. I had never really done much on education in my time. When I was previously in this Parliament, I was on the Justice Committee. I felt I was coming in as a former party leader who didn't know any of the other members. And while we have had differences, and quite strong and robust differences, I don't feel my authority as convener of the committee is diminished in any way, and the way I can work with other members, because I hadn't been elected in a vote in the chamber. The committee members accept that for education and 3 other committees it will be a Conservative member, and they will work with the convener to do their job. They are less interested in the convener if they are able to do and ask the questions they want to do. And I don't think, therefore, having a vote in the chamber would change how any of our committee members work on their own or combined as a committee.
Rhoda?
I don't entirely agree with that. I think there is value to having elected conveners. I think it gives the committee kind of ownership of that person. That becomes a committee person rather than, a party person. So I understand what Douglas Ross is saying about, you could have only one. But I think once you realise which parties have the convenership, then it is open for people to put themselves forward. Now, I know this is a difficult situation, especially for someone who was a party leader and chose the conveners. But you would know which parties had a convenership. And it would be then open for people from that party to put themselves up for the convenership. And if they had an interest, they go. Now, obviously, party leadership would be encouraging their favoured people. But it also gives a role for people who maybe aren't that favoured within the party political system, who may be slightly more independent, who may be more questioning of government. And I think if you removed Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers from that ballot, I think that's right, because the role of that committee convener is to scrutinise them. That gives a more fairness across the Parliament. And I think it could work. I don't think it would be without teething problems. While people got used to that new way of working and realised, it would maybe take a couple of attempts for people to realise how it really worked and how it empowered backbenchers. But I think it really could empower backbenchers and make committees more independent.
Karen, I think you wanted to come.
Conveners are already elected. They're elected here by a fair democratic process, and I don't think that electing a convener would change the effectiveness of that position for that person at all. In fact, it might introduce more party politics to come into play. I mean, I think it's a reasonable discussion to have and a good debate to have, though.
Sorry, Karen, can I just clarify? Do you mean they are elected because they are MSPs that come in here? Or they're elected because they're already technically elected by the committee? You mean the route into this Parliament?
Into the Parliament originally is, by a fair democratic election. So they're already elected on the premise that the MSPs are coming in here to do various different roles. And being seen for the qualities that each individual MSP has by those who know them the best within their group, I think is the most effective way to do that.
Does that sit comfortably with the fact we also elect the PO and the DPOs?
I think, coming into Parliament as a new MSP as well and being presented by, with emails from people and names asking to be elected, as DPOs, and having to go and do that scrutiny on those people and those individuals to get to know and understand them a bit better in that decision as to who to vote for. I think that gives a bit of an insight as well as to perhaps why it would be best for those who know those individuals better to make that decision.
Ross?
Yeah, so we certainly support elected conveners. I think the single biggest potential danger with that is you could end up in a scenario where, whether this is reality or even just perception, of a majority government choosing who scrutinises it. I think the way that you mitigate against that is what Rhoda's proposed, which is that it's only backbenchers who are able to vote on that anybody who is a minister at the point of convenership elections isn't able to vote. I think that's a good middle ground, because we certainly would disagree with the Conservatives' proposal, or what I understand to be the Conservatives' proposal, to take the ministers out of the DeHont allocation when deciding overall committee composition, because I think that goes to the point I said before of it's moving too far away from the election result and the democratic mandate we've got. But removing ministers from the ballot for electing committee conveners, I think, mitigates against that. And on the point of, in some cases, in a number of cases, I imagine the next session, Parliament would be potentially choosing from a field of one. That's no worse than the current situation. It certainly doesn't take us backwards, but what we could have, at least for some committees, is a situation where people have to, candidates have to lay out in advance how they would run the committee. And I think that's helpful. I think back to my experience in 2016. Obviously, this session, there was only one candidate for presiding officer. 2016, there were multiple candidates, and those candidates did the rounds of members, laying out to us all what they would change about how the Parliament operated. And I thought that was a really beneficial debate for us to have right at the start of the Parliament. And committees are a microcosm of that, and you could have exactly that same debate around a lot of the issues that we're talking about this morning, how a convener would actually run a committee. Would they have spice questions, for example, going back to a bugbear of ours? So there is an advantage there. It might not result in every committee having an open contest, multiple candidates, different platforms about how they would run it. But if even some committees did, I think that would still be an improvement on the situation that we've got at the moment. And that's no criticism of the individuals who are conveners in this session. But there's certainly no opportunity in advance of people being appointed as conveners for other members of Parliament to say to them, well, how would you run it if you were
so
chosen?
members would get an insight not just into why an individual is interested in that committee, but also, and I think you've been very eloquently describing this, the process, the approach, the empathy that they would bring as convener for an approach, so that people understood, even before the committee started, the sort of committee that would be, and that you think would be to the benefit of both the Chamber and a wider audience.
Absolutely, and that was the experience that we had in 2016, certainly, where it was about the Parliament as a whole and multiple candidates laying out what they would do in terms of the extension of First Minister's questions, for example. It used to be half an hour, it's now 45 minutes, because that was part of Ken McIntosh's platform that he pitched to members. I do think, the more I think about what Rhoda's proposed, the more important I think it is that ministers are taken out of that ballot to make sure you don't have a situation where governments are choosing those who lead the scrutiny. If it's a majority government, of course.
To go back to your initial question, in complete opposite to Douglas, I would say yes, yes and yes. And I think I do have a different view on this now, as, obviously I can completely understand why the government and why party leaders want to control who leads committees that they are entitled to run, and I understand that. But if you look at this from a strength of scrutiny perspective, then perhaps you might do things differently. And I think, whether we agree with it or not, I think it is arguable that there is a perception out there that we have a situation where party appointees are overseeing scrutiny. And if we look at, we just did a quick calculation, but in this session, it looks like around about 75% of the legislation going to committees is government legislation. So therefore, the Parliament need to think carefully, I believe, about the balance between the executive and the legislature, I would argue that balance, we haven't got that balance right, and I gave a couple of examples earlier.
So do you think, Ash, that the actual vehicle of an election potentially allows individuals to, I think, as Ross has indicated, if they're going to say this is how the committee is going to run, both to allow themselves to take off the rosette, but also to set themselves the standards they'd be tested against if they were elected as convener?
I do, because having been in a and obviously I can't speak for everyone, but what I've observed in political parties, and not just in the two that I've been in, is that this would mean that instead of being put there as by your party, you've been put there by the Parliament, and I think that would add a layer of, strength and. A strength there that people would then feel that they were doing the job for the Parliament rather than from their party. Would you go as far as
legitimacy?
I think it would add legitimacy, yes, because I think that as I've going back to the perception is that it's not that they're not legitimate. To take up Karen's point, we are all elected, and we are following a system where it's proportional. I think everybody understands that, but I would argue that what I've seen in this session, the balance of scrutiny is off here, and so I think as a Parliament we need to think about how we do better on that. We can use a secret ballot. I think there were some good suggestions about excluding certain people from voting, because I think some parties favour loyalty over competence. Not in all cases, but I have observed that myself, and I think that's something as a Parliament we maybe need to think about.
Thank you. Willie? You have 3 seconds.
I would favour, and I would say the benefits are freedom, just a bit more freedom from the whip. Secondly, is stability. If you appointed a convener or elected a convener, I think they'd be there for the 5 years. So that would bring that stability, which would be a benefit. A separate career path for politicians. So rather than aspiring always to be a spokesperson or a minister, they would see a convenership as a credible career path for them to pursue. So again, slightly freer from the whip. And then I think it would build in a bit more bipartisanship. So collaboration, because you would have to seek the support of other parties. And I think, therefore, it would bridge the divide a little bit, give a bit of comfort to both sides that you had a convener there who is actually going to do a fair and reasonable job. Of course, there's downsides. I mean, Douglas highlighted some of them. But I actually think overall, I would agree with Ross that the benefits are that even if it's only half or 3/4 of the committees that end up having a contest, I think that will be better than what we have just now, for all the reasons I've said.
Thank you. Annie, can I come over to you?
Morning, guys. Thanks very much for coming in. I think we've touched on it quite a bit this morning, but it's about induction and training. And I know when we started in 2016, it was the first time that they had done that. And I found it really helpful at the time. But what do you think when people do come into the role of a committee member? What knowledge do you think they need to actually fill that role? And should it be the party or the Parliament that advises them what they should be expecting to do in that role as a committee member? Can I come to Rhoda first, actually, Rhoda?
Yeah, I think parties have a role, but I think it's really important that the Parliament does that, because it's a parliamentary role, and it's important that people are supported in that. I think probably the induction training should have 2 parts. I think the mechanisms, the way that the Parliament works, the way committees work, the expectation of members as well, I think has to take place, and I think that should be across the board. But also an induction into the subject area that people are, so people may have an interest and that's why they're on that committee. But I think there are ways, and I think we've all experienced it, you go onto a committee and you feel like people are speaking a different language for the first few weeks and months on the committee, and you're like really at sea because there is so much knowledge built up in a committee of the subject area. I think it's important to try and get an induction into the subject area as well, so you begin to understand the structures and what you're scrutinising and what knowledge you need to kind of really hold people to account properly. And then I think there's that joint committee training where people are trained to work together and question together and the like.
Ross, yeah.
Yeah, on your question of is that for parties or Parliament, I think the answer is both, because there are competing priorities in committee. And our party priorities, our ideological priorities, are entirely legitimate, because, as Karen said, we've all been elected here. We all have a democratic mandate to pursue a particular agenda. But that's quite different, I think, the more practical training that Parliament can support. One thing I would actually suggest is, I think it was beneficial that when we came in 2016, we got that induction. Part of that was about the legislative process. I actually think that there were probably other things that should have came in first, given what I said earlier on of there's very little legislation right at the start of a parliament, so you actually have more time to train members in how to, in the bill process. Training in post-legislative scrutiny should probably come first, because it's at the start of a parliament that you have the time to do that. And if you have any committees that are having to deal with emergency legislation or whatever it is, then they can get priority legislation training. But there's some core elements that I think are maybe missing at the moment. I mentioned earlier on the review of the Fiscal Commission that recommended all MSPs get training in Scottish public finance. I think that is important. I was speaking to Revenue Scotland last week, who would certainly be very keen for all members to know what they do. Because if you think of folk who get elected here, generally have some level of awareness and interest in how the Scottish public sphere works. So there'll be some public bodies that everybody is familiar with.
Right.
So I'd be surprised if anybody got elected here and didn't know what the SQA was. Most people would probably have heard of SEPA. A number of people probably are elected here and are not familiar with Revenue Scotland, because it's one of those kind of background bodies. But it's at the core of how everything in the Scottish public sphere works, because of its role in finance in particular. So there's maybe a need to do a bit of mapping there. And I say that with the caveat of, I think it was the Information Commissioner that said every time he looks he finds another public body that he didn't realise existed. So it's not quite as simple as saying here's the list of every public body in Scotland, because it seems that we keep finding new ones. The SPCB appointed bodies are really important, though. Ash mentioned that earlier on. So it was a Finance Committee inquiry that led to the standalone committee that's working on that at the moment. I do think that certainly what we found from that inquiry was quite clear that there is and has been a lack of understanding across Parliament for the bodies that we are directly responsible for, that not we are responsible for scrutinising the operations of, but they're still accountable to ministers, or your local government, for example, is accountable to other elected representatives. There are a number of bodies that are appointed by and accountable to this Parliament, but who come under very, very little scrutiny, less scrutiny than they would want. The evidence we got from them is they wanted to be brought in and grilled far more often. But members sometimes just either weren't aware that they existed, or just weren't quite clear that not only is that Parliament's responsibility, but we are the committee with the clear portfolio responsibility and relationship with that particular body.
Perfect. Anybody else want to come in? I don't want to ask everyone the question if we don't need to. Yes, Douglas.
If I don't mention it, Finlay Carson will not forgive me, but he has been very clear that the change that we experienced in 2016 for the training was really good to get things up and running. In 2021, because we were the COVID Parliament, there was less ability to do that face-to-face training and important interaction between the new members on the committee, and he certainly felt it took committees longer to get up and running. So that's something I think we would stress, that face-to-face, almost kind of team bonding was important for committees to get off on the right foot.
Perfect. I've just got another two quick ones.
Yeah,
obviously, most people in here are spokespersons as well as a committee member. How does the party explain the sort of a difference in balance in being a spokesperson and being a committee member? And should it be that one's left at the door when they walk in and the other one the same? It's a difficult one, I think, to sort of balance there, and should the party be guiding them as to how much importance, it's a word I probably won't use, but importance there is on their party role to their committee role? Karen?
I'd like to come in on that, because I can say that we are encouraged to ensure that when we are scrutinising at committee, that we are looking objectively. But the point is that we are here and we're aligning with our political party values. And there are obviously many times when we're going to agree with what's been said with those who are in the same political party as us. But I think something that's really important that we have to press on is that having that important scrutiny is really undermined when there's opposition for opposition's sake. And that's a flip side to having agreeableness for agreeableness' sake. And we are encouraged to go in there as members and cast a critical eye, because that robust scrutiny over law is important to make the best law possible for the people of Scotland. And as I said at the beginning, that means that we have a robust government. So that is encouraged, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else get anything on? Willie, yeah, and I'll come back to you, Rhoda.
So, I mean, I ask questions that I might not agree with when I'm in committee. Mm-hmm. So we've been doing stuff about the tertiary education bill, and I've been asking tough questions on both sides, because I think it's really important to uncover the facts on that. I'll come to a different conclusion at the end. I won't be a liberal and pick both options. I will pick one side. But I think it's important that when we're going through that initial phase that we do interrogate very robustly. And of course, everybody from time to time plays the political more than the scrutiny. Of course that happens, and that happens with all parties. It's not just opposition parties that do that. But I hope members see the benefit, that other members of the committee see the benefit of members who are prepared to get to the facts rather than just take a party position.
Perfect, Willie. Rhoda, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, and I think everything that was said before about committees kind of following the evidence, I think, is right. But I suppose the other thing that spokespeople get being in a committee is access to knowledge. And I think that helps formulate policy. So sometimes the committee is actually, and the work of the committee guides that, because it gives an insight to the policy area that you might not otherwise have if you weren't on that committee. So I think it's quite important in that role that people have that knowledge and experience. But I think, yes, your job is to scrutinise, and it's more, I suppose, effective or more impactful on government members within a committee, but it also gives those committee members something to go back to government, and I'm pretty sure those conversations go on behind the scenes all the time, because the committee has discovered something. The members in that committee will be going back to the government members saying, hang on a minute, you know, this is what we've discovered. So it does work both ways, and that knowledge and experience is really helpful, not only holding government to account, but formulating policy.
Yes, Ross.
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely with Rhoda's point that of anybody in this place, it's party spokespeople. We really want to be subject specialists, and therefore being on the committee, I think, has clear advantages. But on the question of leaving your party hat, your party affiliation at the door, Willie laid out really well why I think that's important for scrutiny, where you're challenging all sides of an argument. Where it comes to the point where we actually have to vote in committee stage 2 on bills or on SSIs or whatever it might be, there is more of a balance to be struck there, because we were all elected here on particular platforms. We have a mandate based on our manifestos. I think it is legitimate to say, on the basis of evidence that's collected, that you might come to a different conclusion to what's in your manifesto. So, for example, our manifesto at the last election said we would support legislation to improve transitions for disabled young people into adulthood. Now, we ended up voting against a bill that came forward on that topic because we didn't believe that particular bill was going to achieve that outcome on the basis of the evidence. But you do need to make sure that there's a balance there, because ultimately we are all here because people voted for us to be here. They voted for us to be here because they thought we would pursue particular policy agendas. Those are all legitimate. We have that legitimacy because people voted for us. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, in all circumstances, in committee, we leave our party rosette at the door. For scrutiny, absolutely. I think 99 times out of 100 that should be the case. But we legislate in committee just as much as we do in the chamber. Actually, there are more votes in committee than there are in the chamber. And our default position for that, our starting point should be the democratic mandate we're here on. If we vary from that on the basis of the evidence, I think the public would understand why. But if we were to start going into committee and just constantly voting against the promises that we had made to get here, there's a wider point there around democratic legitimacy that I'd be worried about.
I'm content with that, convener. I think time's marching on, so I think a lot has been covered. Thank you.
Emma, can I pass over to
Thanks, Convener. A few of you have already mentioned smaller committees and the benefits there. I wondered if anybody has any comments on potential limitations.
Thank you. It's a test. I think there would be limitations with smaller committees in that there may be a smaller pool of diverse voices to hear from. And I think there was an inquiry done on, at Westminster, and the outcome of that was that the most effective committees were between 6 to 12 members. And I think that's because it gives the best diversity of views in that regard. If we pull from the gender-sensitive audit as well that the Scottish Parliament did, I think taking into consideration that we need to have a broad range of views from you know, women's perspective as well. It's equally important. So my concern would be that with a smaller committee, we might maybe cancelling out voices that could have an input that would improve that scrutiny overall and the outcomes for people. We need that proportional representation as much as possible and in every aspect as possible. But I know in reality that can be hard to achieve. But we should be reaching for that.
There's potentially the danger with, as much as I favour smaller committees as a default position, there's the proportionality issue that we talked about earlier on, especially looking ahead to the next Parliament, what the composition might be. If you've got, let's say, 6 parties here, but a number of 5-member committees, you are by default going to have at least one party not represented on those committees. It gets to a point where it's never going to be perfect. Across the whole Parliament, across all committees, you need to ensure that balance. But if it is regularly the case that there is only 1 or at best 2 slots per party on a committee, the other potential danger is in terms of who the party puts forward to be on the committees, that those dissenting voices of more independent mind, however you might want to phrase it, might find their opportunities to sit on a committee at all, or to sit on the committees that they would provide greatest value for, are reduced as a result of party management decisions, whereas with larger committees, by necessity, parties need to fill those slots. It's harder to keep people off a committee, even if party whips may think that actually that would be beneficial for the sake of their internal harmony, but the Parliament misses out as a result of that.
I don't think there are huge disadvantages. I mean, on certainly gender representation and that, I think that starts a lot earlier. I think parties need to make sure that their elected members are representative of the Scottish people in the first place. And I think if that were to happen, then there wouldn't be the same issues about gender representation as there are. But I think even if committees were able to co-opt people on, if there was, I think, much more flexibility around the committee system, smaller, more fleet-of-foot committees, but with the ability to be more flexible, I think would be better. And setting up subcommittees, rapporteurs, subcommittees of maybe 2 or 3 committees to look at things as well, I think would work well.
Just before others come in on that, can I ask you to expand on co-option and how you would see that working?
Well, if you knew, and this kind of, it almost happens by accident at the moment, but members who are interested in a piece of legislation tend to go along and sit on a committee, as all members can. But suddenly their line of questioning and their input makes a difference. So you could do that on a more formal basis, especially, and I think it's happened in the past as well with other committees, when you know another committee may have an interest, you invite someone on as a rapporteur. And that gives them more insight into the committee papers as well. That gives them a more formal role on that committee. So there are ways around it. I think sometimes we're just a wee bit set. That's the committee, that's the way it stays forever. We maybe just need to make sure that we devise the system to fit the purpose.
Douglas?
would look at the limitations of not changing it. Again, I speak as someone who convenes a committee of 10, and our committee is very good, everyone wants to ask a question, so you have the opportunity to not have everyone asking a question, or their questions are not allowed to get into as much depth as we have today. There's less opportunity for supplementary questions. I also think with smaller committees there's more opportunity for additional committees. So again, in our paper we're saying we should go back to a standalone post-legislative scrutiny committee, which I think there's been large agreement on today. You're able to do that more freely if you have more members available, because there are less in each committee. And it's not quite the same as Rhoda was saying about rapporteurs or co-options. But going back to Dundee University, we had 4 additional members came along because it was a big issue in the North East. If everyone had turned up that day, that would have been 14 MSPs seeking to ask questions, and it would have gone longer than the 3 hours it did go on for. So with a smaller committee, I think there's more opportunity for people to come in with their personal interests to be able to engage, because if you're coming at the end of 10 actual committee members, there's not much time for those with additional interest.
Yes, I'd agree with some of that. I just want to address this point about the smaller parties, and I think it's a fair point. But let's say you've got a party that's got like 5, 6 seats. You wouldn't be able to sit on you wouldn't have the capacity to sit on every committee anyway. So I think there would be an understanding that the smaller parties wouldn't be represented on every single committee. As I said, I'm currently sitting on a committee of 5, which is the first time that I've ever done that, and I'm surprised at how effectively we are working. In this instance, the only party that's not represented is the Lib Dems. And I wonder if there's, we've had a bit of talk about how the representation in the Parliament might be quite different after the next election. And I wonder if the Parliament need to reflect then on what you do with independents, or somebody like me, where there's maybe a party only manages to elect 1 or 2 or 3 people. You're not a political party for the intents and purposes of the Parliament, and in that instance you wouldn't be entitled. I'm not entitled to a place on a committee at the moment, and I wonder if that's an issue, that perhaps there would be expertise or capacity there that then wouldn't be brought into the committee system if we stick to the strict proportionality basis. So I think the smaller committees are more effective.
Do you want to?
The only other additional potential downside is just the headspace for the members that are on it. They might not be interested in every single important issue. So therefore, if you've got a bigger committee, you're more likely to have 2 or 3 on the committee who will be really interested in it and delve right into it. Now, of course, every member of the committee will do their job, but you really want people there who are passionate about it. So that's potential downside, although I would still favour reducing the size, because you can bring in additional members, you can get over the proportionality issues, and I think it means that people like yourself don't have to sit on 3 committees as well, which I think would just dominate your week. Just even try to keep up with the agenda and the papers, it's almost impossible to do so. So I think you'll get more out of the individual members if they're smaller committees as well.
It's interesting that post-legislative scrutiny keeps coming up as well, and on the idea of having a dedicated committee. Some of our witnesses to the committee inquiry so far, who are maybe more familiar with Westminster and how it works, have mentioned bill committees and the advantages of having those work streams separate, which I think again would require us to have smaller committees. But I was interested, Karen, in your perspective from the Equalities Committee. I know that yourselves expected to have a very busy legislative programme. That's not the case now. How has that allowed you to explore other methods of scrutiny and bring in, issues that maybe weren't going to get that airing if you were just bill after bill after bill?
Yeah, I must say there's always plenty of work. There's a long list of things that we would love to work on, and although we did find ourselves with an open work programme, it was great to be able to have that discussion. We do regularly have work programme discussions, though that's something I've found, having been on other committees, we seem to do more within Equalities Committee. I think because there are often quite topical issues that do come up, so it's important to have that space to allow that. It has given us the opportunity to add in more post-legislative scrutiny. For example, I'm excited to see the BSL Act in June. We will be doing an inquiry on that. But it has given us a space to have a broader discussion on things. We had the Regulation of Legal Services Stage 2, which did have a few hundred, 600 amendments in that bill, and that did take up quite a bit of time. But what we find there is timing as well as the capacity. I think both are can be equally challenging for committee, but and it has afforded us to be able to open up to other streams of work for absolutely.
And to people back to the fact that your party representatives say not that what you're not saying is massively important.
Yes, of course.
And as always, there's an opportunity outside of the formal inquiries to send us information, but I'm just going to gently drag us back to the world of party politics. Sorry, Emma.
That's okay. So I know that quite a few different committees at the moment are looking at bills that maybe don't naturally sit within that remit as a result of certain committees being overloaded legislatively. So do others have comments on the potential of having bill committees?
I'm quite attracted to the prospect of bill committees based on, I think, not just the Westminster experience, but the experience of this Parliament in the past where we have taken that approach, that there is an advantage to it. But it then becomes a question of how you manage committee membership and the role of individual members across a whole Parliament, because bill committees are overwhelmingly going to be needed in the second half of a Parliament where you have lots of legislation coming through. So it's then a question of, are we going to have a situation where in the first half of a Parliament you have quite a lot of members who are maybe not on a committee or who are only on one committee? I think there's an attraction to all of us only being on one committee. I say that as somebody who's been on two for the whole of the time that I've been here. But we need to make sure that we're balancing that across the whole 5 or if it ever ends up going back to 4-year terms. Would we be, if we had bill committees, would we be reducing the size of the standing committees for the period of setting up bill committees in the second half of a Parliament? And we've occasionally done that in the past, but certainly last session there were some committees that had 11 members, but Health Committee started off at 11 and was reduced to 9 by agreement at one point halfway through that session, not to set up a bill committee, but because the government had so many ministers, the SNP didn't have the backbench spaces and asked, would one opposition party be happy to come off health, or to take a member off health if we took a member off health, and that was agreed. So there's a question of how do you balance that, because if you set up bill committees at the start of a term based on what the government says its programme is going to be. As we've seen, a lot of bills don't come forward, and even then, if they did come forward, it would take a couple of years. You'd have a bill committee with not a lot of work to do. The alternative is you then have a very uneven distribution of how many members are required to sit on committees across the whole term of the Parliament, and I'm not totally sure how we would manage that. Not that there aren't plenty of other ways that we can usefully occupy our time.
So is the concern that there'd be too many, or would that maybe be circumvented by only setting up a bill committee for particularly large bills, or where we're expecting there'll be, hundreds and hundreds of amendments? Yeah,
so I think you could do it that way, where it's a bill that is going to have 600 amendments to it. Flip side of that is generally bills like that, having the expertise of people who've sat on, for example, a committee dealing with civil law for a number of years before you get to the point where there's a bill so contested it's got 600 amendments, there's probably an advantage. But if we're kind of marrying that up, you could have more than one post-legislative scrutiny committee. You could have post-leg scrutiny committees by portfolio, with a kind of general understanding that that's how they'll operate in the first half of the Parliament. But then once you get to the point where there's lots of bills coming through, you could phase out those committees and move towards a bill committee structure. So that way the number of members required to sit on committees is broadly even across the whole of a parliamentary session.
So I'd quite like the convener's suggestion of the committee adopts a different persona depending on its function. But there isn't enough time in the week and there aren't enough MSPs to have all of that. I think there needs to be, just as a side point, a little bit of self-control from members, and I'm sure I'm as guilty as anybody else, on the number of amendments that are put forward to bills. The housing bill just now is just extraordinary. The number of amendments that are in your committee is sitting for weeks. in order to go through them all. We had a similar one with the Education Reform Bill, where it went on for some time. But secondly, members putting forward their own members' bills, which there are a lot of them. And I don't want to be in a position where saying we can't allow that freedom to do that. But it has crept up over the years, and there's more of it. And there's almost a competition to have, you know, more amendments and a bill. And I think for the committees, it's almost impossible to give it due attention. And therefore, I think there just needs to be an encouragement for members just to step back a little bit. Of course, do the important stuff, but just reflect themselves when it is absolutely essential. I put this amendment down, I think, is something they've got to consider.
Douglas?
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced both systems, and I think we've got to be careful that we don't just say, well, Westminster's got elected conveners and they seem to have more authority down there, Westminster have bill committees, etc. It's a very different situation, and they have far more members, 650 compared to our 129. Where I think there is merit here is dividing the two, but with the same expertise. So one of the questions earlier, I don't know if Rona or the convener, should committees meet more? Yes, I think we all bar Ash agreed we should, and therefore perhaps the subject committees meet as normal, and then as legislation comes, they meet separately. So they would still meet on a Wednesday morning and do their normal work, but they would meet additionally that week to do bill consideration. When that bill's done, they go back to once a week. And I think the benefit of that, where I think the Westminster system is better, is they can be far more agile and reflective of what is happening at the time. We have had many issues on education, and I know other committees that Conservatives convene, where we want to get into topical issues, but because we have bills to get through, there is simply no time. When you can address an issue within a week or two of it becoming a big issue, then the public are interested in what our committees are doing. At the moment, there is very little interest with what the committees are doing, despite the very good work we're doing, because we tend to get bogged down with legislation, not dealing with the topical issues they're discussing during the day.
I think we are keen on flexibility, so if we need bill committees, we should have them. I guess one example that just springs to my mind, we in the Rural Committee are at the moment looking at the Natural Environment Bill. So part of that sits within rural, but a huge part of it sits within net zero. It was very obvious early on that we had an in-depth knowledge about the rural stuff, and we could immediately see the holes in the legislation, and then we thought the natural environment stuff was fine. And I said, well, we may think it's fine because we don't have the knowledge for that deep dive. And as we're taking evidence, then, of course, we're beginning to find where the pitfalls are. It might have been much better to have a bill committee made up of members of both committees, so that they had that knowledge and experience, and especially with those kind of cross-cutting bills that don't sit happily in one committee or another. So flexibility, I think, is the name of the game, and we need to have the system that provides the scrutiny that is required.
Please, Karen.
Could I please come in there? We do already have the availability of flexibility within our committees to be able to sit twice a week if we so wish to. You can meet, previously I've met in evenings, we've had away days, we've had work programme planning days. So there is already a flexibility within the framework of committees to be able to do that. It's for the convener and the members to discuss that and decide what they'd like to do on that. So they could already decide to have specific days of the week set aside to scrutinise bills.
Emma, come back to you.
It sounds, Ash, like your perspective on proportionality within committees has kind of been influenced by this short-term committee that you're sitting on, where it's not proportional, but there's more parties represented. Do you have more to say on that, and do others feel that there's maybe an advantage in ditching proportionality and focusing on breadth?
Don't think we'd get anyone else at this table to agree to ditch proportionality. And probably we shouldn't. You know, I'm not suggesting that we do that. But I do feel strongly that I think committees need to be made smaller. And I think that's the way we're all agreeing there's a capacity issue here for legislation, also for scrutiny of, you know, holding government to account or holding public bodies to account. So I think we need to think carefully about that. And perhaps if we had committees in different categories, I mean, the reason that I think I'm probable the Lib Dems were invited to sit on the committee that I'm currently on and perhaps just didn't have the capacity to do so. And it's probably ended up like that because this committee is not going to have legislation in front of it. There's not going to be a vote. So I think that the larger parties probably were quite relaxed about the idea of it not having the same level of proportionality. So perhaps there's, perhaps there is an opportunity for that in committees where they might look at work in a different way. Then maybe you could relax the proportionality, but for other ones, for understandable reasons, education, justice and so on, you know, the major parties are obviously going to want to be represented on there.
Sorry, Mr. Sensash, the proportionality has been reached in that there are all but one party's voices around the table. But the proportionality, when you talk about then the balance of voting, is not a problem for your committee.
Yeah.
Do you think the not voting, and I'm not inquiring as to the internal workings of the committee, is the fact that there wasn't a sort of potential it's going to come down to vote? Do you think that assisted with the sort of environment that the committee's worked in?
I think it has. Because for that very reason, that I think if this was a committee that was set up like the other ones, that the main parties would be wanting to have their proportionality, which is fine. But perhaps there are other instances like the committee that I'm sitting on now where we can relax that in order to do, I mean, this is just a 6-month committee set up for a very focused, you know, as Ross said, the Finance Committee suggested this committee be set up short-term working for a very focused outcome. And perhaps that there's much smaller committees are much better at that, because you can work faster, it is more agile, and you haven't got to, like we're saying, you know, go around and make sure 11 people have asked a question, you know, because it can get a bit much at times.
Thank you. Sorry, Emma. Don't know if...
No, that's fine. If nobody else has got comments on that, then my final question was more around the structure that allows members to sit on multiple committees. What does keep coming up here today is the potential for extra meetings or extra committees to be set up, which does become more difficult if your parliamentary week is already block booked with multiple committees. What more could be changed in the overall structure of how Parliament sets up committees that allows that flexibility, not just from the perspective of policy, but membership of the committee as well?
Who would like to say? Rhoda? Three.
As someone who lives a distance away from the Parliament, I think COVID was awful, but the one thing it did give us was the ability to work much more flexibly. And that then, and I'm not trying to take away from constituency time, because I think that's really important for MSPs, but it does give the ability to hold committees online. And also, I think we should be pushing committees out of the Parliament, to be honest. In kind of previous parliaments, pre-COVID, committees travelled a lot. And I think it gives members an understanding of the issues in different parts of the world, but it also brought the Parliament much closer to other parts of the world too, that people could engage. And I think it was really good. So I think we need to look back at that, but also just because we have the ability to work remotely, you could have a committee meeting that was totally remote and held on a different day, so you're not totally stuck, or held in the evening or some other time. You're not totally stuck within the mornings as we are at the minute.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's the challenges to having more space for committee meetings are wider than just how we structure committees in the Parliament. And Willie touched on part of it a moment ago. I think that we do need to have a conversation that is a challenging one to have for obvious reasons around whether 129 is still the right number of members for a Parliament that was set up that way in 1999, but now has far more responsibility than it did at that point. So there's a fundamental capacity issue there. Much as I really enjoy our constituency work and casework, I also think that we end up doing far more casework than parliamentarians in a lot of other European countries do, because local government in this country is so weak. And if we had stronger local government or more local government, there would be far less individual casework coming to members of our Parliament. Scandinavian countries, for example, colleagues I've spoken to there find it extremely unusual how much individual casework we do. Now, you could argue that makes us better when we come here because we have that on-the-ground understanding, but there's still a massive capacity challenge. Within the building, there's also the tension of the amount of time we spend in the chamber for debates that I think we would all question the public value of. And we know why that's the case and why there are often debates that are a bit bland or where the point is not particularly clear. It's for reasons of political management, government not wanting to lose a vote, opposition parties also wanting to avoid certain difficult issues at times. Perhaps we can move to a point where there's collective understanding that the chamber doesn't need to sit every afternoon when Parliament is sitting, and whether it is once a fortnight, once a month, whatever, we agree that actually there's an afternoon where the chamber doesn't sit, and if we know that far enough in advance, committees can schedule extra meetings during that time, so it gives us a bit more time for, I think, what we all agree, which is the importance of committee work and trying to balance that workload. You can make a counter-argument that actually we should be spending time in the chamber more effectively.
Press, what would your party's view be if, as happens in other legislatures, you had a week where it was just committees sitting and there was no chamber sitting? So, you know, there are a number that choose, and I'm going to say this and then not be able to point to any evidence, but where the chamber sits one week and then the week each side is just given over to committees, so that you don't have that challenge, but you can also address the fact people are sitting on more than one committee.
We would err on the side of a bit less chamber time and a bit more committee time being preferable. You could easily tip that too far. If we end up spending twice as much time in committees as we currently do and far less time in the chamber, obviously there's a point at which that becomes impractical, like where we are now in a parliamentary session where we're doing a lot of stage 2s at the moment. We're going to quickly get to the point where there's a lot of stage 3, which there's a necessity to chamber time at that point. I think we could all probably acknowledge, certainly in private, that a lot of our chamber time is not born out of necessity. The topics certainly aren't born out of necessity at the moment. So we would skew towards a bit more time in committee, a bit more time allocated to committees than at present, and a bit less chamber time. You could equally argue that there are simply more effective ways to use that chamber time, and there's no shortage of topics that deserve chamber time, but that are not getting it at the moment.
I'm very conscious of time, and we've sort of drifted on. Sue, I want to come to you because you're talking about this sort of culture approach.
It's more about culture, and I suppose there's a lot of stuff that has been covered, so I'm not going to dwell on that. So I was looking to try and unearth what you think some options might be for strengthening committees and making a much more cross-party culture in terms of that effectiveness. So we've heard already about all sorts of things, elected conveners, but even better use of visits and engagements, agreeing what your scrutiny priorities were. Ms Adams spoke about having a lot of time for a work programme. That's something I do not recognise as an education convener. When you have got legislation thrown at you at every angle, you don't have the opportunity to have a work programme discussion. So how do we manage to create that real working together culture within the confines we have, and what might we be able to do? Douglas, can I come to you first?
I'll go back to what I said to Annie. First of all, I think those early days are important to get that relationships built up. I remember when I joined the Justice Committee, there were people I didn't know, but after a year of being on it, actually you get on better both within the committee and out with. But Rhoda made a point that I had thought about at the start of the session. It's maybe just my observation, but Parliament does not seem to be sitting out with this building very much. So if you were to do more outreach, you were to do more visits, and say the Education Committee went up to Aberdeen to do a visit in Aberdeen and had their session in Aberdeen, that not only brings Parliament closer to the people who elect us, it means you're out of this building, you're away from your emails, you're away from the chamber, and as a committee, out with the time of your visit and your committee session, you're doing things together on a more personal basis and less adversarial, because you're not doing the scrutiny or the legislation. So I actually think we should try and get out of here, not all of the time, but a bit more to build up those relationships and perhaps change the culture a bit in each of the committees.
Thanks, Douglas. Karen?
On that point, I think we had a really good example on Tuesday evening of how this Parliament can work exceptionally well cross-party when we've taken party politics out of that discussion and out of that scrutiny. And
that
of course,
that wasn't committee. That was
that wasn't
chamber.
at
So
committee.
Can we please keep on to committee? If you
I'm
don't
saying
mind.
it was just a good example of that cross-party working. So if we look at the culture that was cultivated there and carry that through into committee with that mindset, knowing that we're all working towards, a common purpose of trying to create the best outcomes, the best law, and have the best scrutiny on topics. Absolutely practical things like working together on work programmes, having away days, all those sorts of things. But I think it's really important to look at pulling that very topical politics as well out of that.
Okay, Rhoda, then Ash.
I just reiterate, I think committees going out and about, and it allows more committee meetings and makes them more accessible to the public.
Ross, you had some ideas around, obviously, you mentioned it in your previous answer, so don't want to go over it about having different settings and a different feel to the entire parliamentary week.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a way that we can rebalance the parliamentary week, and that comes back to what I was saying around the value of chamber time, etc. I would absolutely agree with getting out of the building being important, both for that kind of teamwork, team bonding, but also the perspectives that you get. I almost pose this as a question because I'm not and have not been a committee convener. I know there's multiple current and former conveners in the room. My understanding as a member of multiple committees over the past is that the challenge with getting authorisation to go out with this building often is getting the conveners group to sign off on that, and that has varied depending on the composition of the conveners group over the kind of decade-ish.
Or perhaps where the committee is intending on going.
Well, that's part of it. I do remember hearing one anecdote, I won't mention what session or what committees it was, but where one committee convener couldn't get authorisation to go to Coatbridge, and then the next committee convener got sign off to go to Brussels. And the first one felt rather bruised by that. And it was perhaps observed that it was the showmanship of the presentation for the value of the second trip maybe swung it. But I think we all know what the underlying nervousness there is. Money is finite, and we should be effective stewards of public finances. But there's also, every committee trip gets FOI'd. We had a recent finance committee trip where we went to London for the meeting of the Inter-Parliamentary Finance Committee Forum. So it does what it says on the tin. There's a necessity once or twice a year for all the parliaments of this country's finance committees to come together. It still ended up as a Daily Express story where all of the committee's collective spending, which came to about £3,000, was all attributed to me personally, because the Daily Express does love a Ross Greer headline, apparently. Now, I didn't mind that. But but there is, and I understand the nervousness that a lot of members have, because the perception of us spending public money and ever leaving this building is often misrepresented and manipulated. But I think we do need to be brave enough to say that no, there is actually a necessity, and that the range of advantages to it are vast enough. And my understanding is that that would require a change in what has been, I don't know if it's the case right now, but certainly over the time I've been here, the kind of dominant culture of hesitation within the conveners group to authorising these kind of outward bound activities.
Yeah, having been a convener and having been on those convener groups, I want to go back to this again. It's about culture, and I want to speak around, about Ms Adam again said was about the robust scrutiny and making the best law possible, and then linking that to the role the convener plays in perhaps the selection of witnesses that come forward, so that will drive how effective your committee has been. Perhaps can I come to you first, Douglas, on that again, and then move along?
Yeah, no, thank you. And you'll see in our submission, this is one of the issues that we have cited. Sometimes, and it depends on the convener, but perhaps the clerks have more influence than potentially they should. And they have expertise, and I think that's important. But ultimately, it's up to the committee. I've certainly tried since I came in to get more committee agreement. Certainly on the tertiary education bill, we went through suggestions, and some of the witnesses we have now taken evidence from were not suggestions from the clerk or people I had thought of, but Pam Duncan-Glancy, Ross and Willie and others had good ideas. I also want to use this as an opportunity to make a pitch for our point in here that witnesses should be registering and declaring any interest, because we have found that a number of committees, because of the size of Scotland and our landscape, many of the witnesses are from organisations that are funded by the Scottish Government. And in the same way, if we are asking questions where there is a financial interest, we believe those answering questions should also register a financial interest and make that clear to those who are watching the proceedings.
Thank you. Willie Rennie, I'm just going to go along the line with this one.
Yeah, so I think there's what the particular format I like is getting witnesses here who might have a debate between themselves. We often get uniform panels who are all from one part of the sector and they all say roughly the same thing. But I want to see how they contest the arguments with each other. And I think some of the most productive sessions have been just that. Now, some of them don't want to. They don't want to be in the same room with somebody they're disagreeing with. But actually, I think it's in our interest to see that exchange. So rather than relying on us to ask the questions, you're almost getting them to ask the questions of each other. And I think that's particular value. But this comes back to the role of the clerks, the role of SPICE, and the independence of the members. How much control are they going to take over their committee, and how much are they going to be led by the professionals who know a hell of a lot, and we do need to draw on that experience. But you need to own the committee. And too often you feel as if the standard questions are being asked, the report that's been produced is just accepted, and therefore, and the witnesses likewise. Members need to take control of it, otherwise it's not their committee.
Thanks, Willie. Ross Greer.
The convener can only dictate who the committee's witnesses are if the committee lets them do that. So and there's an element of interpersonal dynamic to that, and it is easier to disagree with some conveners than others. It's easier to disagree with some members whether they're convener or not than others. But the one point I would make there, as much as I've seen situations where conveners have, perhaps, certainly in my view, been trying to bounce the committee into agreeing with what they wanted to do, or present it as if it is a fait accompli and, by the way, note this, we're moving on. I think a bigger problem is members of the committee just not coming prepared to make alternative suggestions for witnesses, and we probably don't set a clear or a high enough expectation on committee members. Say, every member should come with proposals for who we take evidence from on this, because particularly, it goes somewhat to Douglas's point around the size of this country, there are essentially professional witnesses, because there are some organisations who, of course, we need to hear from on some topics, and they'll always send the same people. But it does create that kind of groupthink that the Parliament and our wider political sphere is often accused of. So that should be the challenge to all committee members. Whether you agree or disagree with the convener's approach to selection of witnesses, we should all be expected to come forward with proposals of our own. And perhaps we should set an expectation of come forward with proposals to seek evidence from people who have never come and given evidence before. And on that, we would maybe need to be a little bit more relaxed than I think we often are, for good reason, around whether or not somebody has put in written evidence before we call them to give oral evidence. If we're really trying to get a more diverse range of views, maybe we should be a bit more relaxed about, OK, they didn't put a written submission in, but that's because they feel so distant from this place. We should make the effort of saying,
really
we'd like you to come here. Yeah. But that's a responsibility on all members, not just the convener.
Sorry, Ross.
This is what I do want to move along. That's okay. Karen, Adam.
Yeah. For the SNP, we have always prioritised hearing from those with lived experience. That's absolutely vital. Hearing how policy affects those very clearly on the ground, on the front line. At committee, I've seen examples of this, for example, when we're doing our human rights budgeting and having people from various backgrounds come in and feedback on what the budget means to them. What do they know about it, the transparency around it? Do they feel that they can scrutinise that? Really valuable work. But also in regards to the Disability Commissioner Bill, when we had people, disabled people with that lived experience, and also autism groups coming in discussing the LDAM bill.
I'm sorry.
Really important
I know this
to have that.
sounds very rude, and I have no intention of being... No, please, there's nothing to apologise for. I'm just very conscious that as representatives of your parties here, that's the approach that we're seeking the input from. So, and I understand that your party absolutely support the lived experience voice being at the committee.
Okay,
so it was just, so when I set out, I said that the SNP is absolutely
so if it's lived experience,
I was just giving some examples of that.
We move quickly to Rhoda and then finally Ash, please.
Yeah,
if you have anything extra to say, Rhoda.
Just, I think that every committee should make sure that their witnesses are representative of the public. I think that should be a rule of thumb, and that falls to everyone, including the committee.
You're talking all voices, all sides?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And I think with hybrid, we can do that. There
yes,
aren't barriers.
Thanks. Ash Regan, finally. Thanks.
Yes, in general terms, I think it's very clear to me on the number of committees that I've been on that the witnesses usually would what we would call the usual suspects. You know, you can almost predict who will appear, and I would agree that we are hearing too much from certain people. I would also beseech committees as well to recognise that not every witness that appears is a professional witness who's paid. Some of them are volunteers, and certainly we saw that through the women's rights campaigning. They were volunteer groups. They weren't able to, they didn't have the capacity to respond and do a turnaround, you know, written statement in a day or 2 days, which did happen. So I think we need to take that into account. I think the conveners, you know, are very instrumental in this. And I would say that certainly during the passage of the GRR bill, the selection of witnesses that was chosen there appeared to be very skewed. It was very skewed towards those that supported the legislation. And it was felt that some of the other groups weren't given the same time to speak, and that when they did speak, they were closed down much more quickly. And also there was other groups that wanted to come and speak. So in that instance, there was a group of women, I think, who would very much be considered as part of lived experience, as they were victims of male violence against women, who wanted to come and give evidence, but were told by the committee that they were not welcome to come and give evidence. And then I think about 12 weeks later, they were told, oh, well, you can put in a written statement. I think as a parliament, we need to be sensitive to, you know, volunteer members of the public who want to engage in democracy and how we treat them. So I don't think that, you know, that was a very good representation.
Do you think there should be a more transparency, in essence, with regard to, say, the witness list? And I think what we've heard from Ross and others, and the responsibility of committee members to be part of that, to be a genuine part of that decision-making.
No, he's quite right in what he said, that the conveners will only be able to get away with that if the committee allow them to do it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm fine, thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Convener.
Can I thank the witnesses for their evidence today? The excitement is that there is a committee debate on Thursday, the 22nd of May, so I hope to see all people contributing to that in areas both personal on behalf of their party and otherwise. If there is anything that comes to mind once you've considered this afterwards and you would like to write to the committee, please feel free to do so. But I will suspend momentarily for a change of witnesses. Thank you all. And can I welcome everyone back to this second panel, where we welcome the Minister for Parliamentary Business, Jamie Hepburn, who is joined this morning by Stephen McGregor, who's Head of Parliament and Legislation Unit for the Scottish Government, and Ailsa Kemp, who's Parliament and Legislation Unit Team Leader for the Scottish Government. Thank you for your patience, Minister. We're going to move straight to questions, so I'm going to throw you in the shark pit and invite Rona to start.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister and officials. In the first panel, we started by asking if they could sum up in one or two sentences what the role of committees is in Parliament. So I'm going to ask the Minister if he could do that, please.
I think it's the first time I've ever been asked to sum up something in one or two sentences, and I hope that doesn't count as my first sentence. Well, I suppose, the most obvious thing as being a legislature is for the committees of Parliament to consider the legislation placed before it, whether that's in its primary form, the process of refinement at stage 2 after having gathered a wide range of evidence, or whether it's statutory instruments, and then thereafter, on the basis of the committee having the autonomy to decide whether there are specific subjects, either government activity that's being undertaken or areas the committee thinks the government's not doing enough in that it can undertake an inquiry in. So within the defined remit of that particular committee. I didn't count how many sentences that was, but I hope
it's a bit more than two.
It helps.
Yeah. And can I ask the Scottish Government's view on the performance of committees in the Parliament?
I don't really think that's for the government to say. We are accountable to Parliament. If committee requires, as you have asked for me to come along today, rightly, we're accountable to Parliament. So I don't think it's really something that the government could earnestly sit here and say what our perspective would be on in terms of the performance of the committees.
So some other parliaments have clearly defined committee structures and it's clear what they're set out to do. Do you think that's something we could maybe do here, maybe do better, have a clearer definition of committees?
A collective one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, that would be for Parliament to decide. I guess it could only be determined in terms of it being effective insofar as what its purpose was. Right now, of course, every committee has a set and defined purpose. Some of them because they're standing committees and it's very clearly understood what they might be, and then subject committees as determined and composed from parliamentary session to parliamentary session, and they will have a remit. So I would observe to some extent it exists. I think it's understood what the role of committees are. So whether or not that needs to be further clarified or defined or written down, that would ultimately be a matter for Parliament. And if thereafter it had any implications for government, then we'd need to consider how that worked in practice.
And can I finally just ask your kind of personal experience as a minister sitting before committees, whether you think, do you think that ministers are being held to account enough? Do you think there's enough?
Far too much.
No. Do you think there's enough discipline in a committee led by the convener? If things get a bit out of hand, do you think that in general terms, I know it will vary from committee, but in general terms, do you think there's enough sort of committee discipline?
Again, I think it would be very difficult for me sitting here as a government minister to be asked by a committee whether a committee exercise enough discipline in terms of holding the government to account. I think that's a rather, not that I've ever thought of Ms Mackay as a shark, as you had suggested she might be. I think that's an invidious position to put me in, Ms Mackay. I don't think that as a government we could set out a perspective. Candidly we might have a private perspective, but as a collective, overt government perspective, we don't have one.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. Thanks.
And it is right, and it's very fair, and you've been very open about this, Minister, that a lot of this inquiry, a lot of the work of this committee is on behalf of the Parliament, and that you would support whatever decision the Chamber and this Parliament reaches, and I genuinely welcome that. I think the interesting aspect with regard to this committee inquiry, on one level, is the fascinating interaction between government and committees, and we managed to get the parties to lift the lid on certain dark secrets that happened underneath. Maybe they will regret that as they look back on their evidence, but we'll see. Also placing an advert for people to look at the evidence. One of the things I want to concentrate on is the value of an elected convener. And I know that I understand, unless I misunderstood this, that the Scottish Government, in essence, don't have a view on that in a sense, because you will address what the Chamber says. But from your point of view, in the Scottish Government, would having someone who was very openly identified as representing the committee, would that aid any of the aspects of discussions that happen both behind the scenes, but sort of at an official level to get, quote, a steer one way or the other? Would having someone who had the authority of the Chamber to be the convener of a committee aid the interaction between Scottish Government and that committee, do you think?
So I think the first thing I should make clear, of course, the Government doesn't have a perspective on whether there should be elected conveners. I don't. Well, of course, it's I suppose it's hypothetical, because if it was to happen, then perhaps it would. But I can't see anything right now in terms of the manner in which we operate in terms of interaction as a government with conveners of the Parliament's committees that would fundamentally alter or change whether or not they had been elected by means of a vote of Parliament collectively, or as they are just now by committees, specifically once committee members have been appointed, and obviously going through the allocation party by party. So I can't think of anything that would by necessity have to change as a consequence.
So in essence, the method of selection wouldn't alter the relationship that the Scottish Government, I know you go out of your way to meet with conveners to ease things, so the method of selection wouldn't alter that approach, as far as you can see.
I can't see in what way it would, frankly, whether or not Parliament has a wider role in electing them, or we go through the process we have just now. My expectation would be, for my own part, to engage with all conveners to talk about parliamentary business more widely and how it might impact committees individually, and for ministerial colleagues to be engaging with conveners as required, and of course committees as a whole as required.
Let me do the easy question for you to answer, because I anticipate how you're going to answer this, and I'm going to ask you a slightly harder one. Obviously, elected conveners have been considered a number of times in this place at different times. As Minister, would you support a move towards having elected conveners?
As a Minister, I would say quite clearly the Scottish Government has no position in respect to whether or not there should be elected conveners. It's a matter for Parliament.
If I sort of absolutely accept your answer to that, do you see the role, in essence, of a potential elected convener, a parliamentarian, being a different pathway for someone who comes to this place?
Well, by its very nature, it's a different pathway. So, sorry, by contrast to being in government, you mean?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, by definition, of course, it's a different path, because it's a different destination. And being a convener of any of the Parliament's committees is a big responsibility, and it's one that I know the various conveners of this Parliament take seriously, as they should.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to throw you at the mercy of Annie now.
Okay.
Good morning, Minister, and thanks for coming along. I'm looking at induction and training, and my question is, what training and support do ministers get when preparing to come in front of committees? And is that something that the Parliament could learn from when it's looking at induction and training for new members joining as well? Is there anything that could swap over?
I'm trying to think. I was first appointed as a Minister in November 2014. And earnestly and honestly, I can't particularly remember any form of induction beyond, relying on the professionalism and expertise of civil servants that are there to support you, and working with more experienced colleagues who've been in government for some time to understand what it's all about. I think, if I recall correctly, I was initially appointed the Health Minister one week, and then the next week I was speaking, giving stage 1 evidence to a bill I hadn't been involved in introducing, and I relied on the officials who'd supported me in terms of pulling together a briefing to get me ready for it. I mean, I suppose I would observe more widely. It'll be down to each individual as well. So if, you know, I'd been a parliamentarian for 7 years before I became a minister, so that brought me a certain level of experience in terms of parliamentary proceedings. So that assisted, you know, but it would be down to each individual to determine what type of additional support they might require, and then for colleagues in government to provide that.
Can I ask one small question as well? Obviously, when I got elected in 2016, we did have an induction programme organised by the Parliament, which it was welcome and it was good. But obviously, when some of my other colleagues joined in 2021, we were in COVID times and things like that. And do you think that the Parliament could learn more about, maybe, I think some of our witnesses earlier talked about CPD, continued professional development as a member, and is that something that we could look at? And this is probably in a personal opinion from yourself.
Well, I see no reason why that shouldn't be possible. Again, you know, that'd be for Parliament to determine. And if you're asking me about these things in a personal capacity, you know, a lot of these things are driven, quite rightly, by the presiding officer of each Parliament. So my recollection, I was elected first in 2007, and I do not recall any form of induction. And I don't know if there was one in 2011, but I think that what happened in 2016 was probably very much driven by the outgoing presiding officer, Trish Marwick. You know, 2021 was obviously a different context, but you know, it'd be for Parliament to decide. But if you're asking me, you know, objectively, would it be of assistance? Well, I would say almost self-evidently, yes, it would be something that would be sensible to do. But for Parliament or for Government.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Convener. That's up from me just now.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just checking the clock, Minister. We've heard a lot.
Is that your way to saying I've got to be quicker?
No, not at all. We're certainly getting through it a lot faster than the morning panel, with having only...
that speaks to government effectiveness.
Yes, indeed.
Well.
Yeah, okay. So we've heard a lot from our various witnesses, and specifically this morning, about the cross-party working and how important it is for the effectiveness of committees. We also heard a little bit about how some of the panel felt that had changed since the Green Party had come out from that official arrangement with the current government. So how does cross-party working, or the lack of it, importantly, impact on government?
Well, certainly, you know, in my time in government, you know, I first came into government when the party had a majority, but irrespective of that, you know, I tried to work with colleagues across parties.
Do you feel it changes in terms of how your outreach into the committees, rather than has that changed a lot in your, as the majority or the position has changed?
No, I can't earnestly say I think it has changed drastically. There is a degree of rough and tumble with politics. We all bring our own perspectives to these things. We've all been elected as party politicians, so that inevitably is going to come to play, whether it's a committee or otherwise. But you know, by and large, I don't think things have changed too drastically in the sense of the experience. Although, you know, I must also be candid. You know, because I'm in government, I don't sit on a committee. So the convener talked about dark secrets. I'm going to keep mine to myself. And you know, I don't know precisely how committees are operating when they're meeting in private session, for example, and nor should I. The government shouldn't know that. So, looking from the outside in, I don't think it looks as though it's changed drastically. But then, of course, I've not sat on a committee since 2014.
This is something that's quite topical. Can I pick up on this? It's going off a bit piece to me, but the bit about the private session, Minister. I mean, there's been an awful lot in the last few weeks in coverage about how the committee is meeting in private to discuss the evidence they've heard, and this should be in public. And but that is part and parcel of our culture and how committees operate and work. But so, how do you think we might be able to present that as not being a closed shop for the public, but that's an important role that the committees play?
I mean, again, I've got to be careful.
I know you've got
Member,
to.
because that is for Parliament to determine if there should be some form of systemic change at point of formalised ways of working. But equally, it's for each committee to determine under its current rules. So, if you're asking me, does the government have any concern about it? No. But if you're asking me, does the government have a perspective as to whether it should change or not? No, the government doesn't have a perspective on that.
Okay. And you've also, it's difficult today because you're speaking on behalf of the government. You've already spoken about if we were to look at ways to strengthen committees and build that culture of real effective cross-party working. We've heard about elected conveners, developing vision statements at the start of sessions, making greater use of visits, off-site evidence taken. We've heard about all of these things. Does the Minister believe, what do you believe might make the most difference to making committees more effective? And is there anything from those options that you might gravitate towards more, or is there anything different? That's a big question.
I genuinely, I mean, it may be of frustration, but I'll probably say this a number of times. We need to be careful because I can't sit here as a government minister and say that would be the best way for Parliament to operate. I think Parliament needs to make that decision.
Okay.
Emma.
Thank you, Convener. I want to just follow up on that briefly before I start my own question. Does government want committees to be more effective?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I suppose that would the first part of that is, is there concerns about effectiveness right now? Well, I'll go back to my initial observation that it isn't for government to say whether or not they are or are not being effective. But, of course we would want that.
Okay. One thing that does keep coming up in the previous panel, but also our evidence sessions beforehand, is the need for smaller committees to allow members to delve more into questioning witnesses. How might that impact government planning, either from a proportionality perspective or how you interact with committees themselves?
I don't think it would change the manner in which we would interact with committees, particularly at all, except for insofar as what the committees might require of us. So, irrespective of their size, I don't think that would change the dynamic or the nature of the relationship between the government as the executive branch or Parliament as the legislative branch. I don't think the size of the committees would particularly drive that. Certainly sitting here now, practical experience, if it was to happen, maybe we would find that it did change the dynamic, but I can't think of any reason, and it's kind of the same point as was made before, would elected conveners change the relationship between the government and the committees of the Parliament. My answer there was I can't see any reason why it would, and again, I can't see any reason why the size of a committee would alter it. Actually, we've probably got evidence. Well, there's evidence to assess it right now, I suppose, and so far as we have committees of various sizes. So this is a fairly small committee, or perfectly formed, maybe I should say, convener. Whereas, actually, that could get me into trouble by contrast with larger committees, so I withdraw that remark. Whereas the Education Committee is a much bigger committee. I'm not aware of anything that in of itself drives different interaction because one is larger than the other. I mean, interaction would be driven by the demands of the individual committee.
Smaller does make it more difficult to be proportional. That was a conversation we had with the last panel. Would the government be concerned about, this committee, there's not a government majority, if that were more common?
Well, the government doesn't have a majority, so I think the key thing, the important thing is, and this does bring pressure to bear, I suppose, and we should recognise it on backbench members of the government party, and that's just inescapable. I think it is important that, having gone through an election and Parliament being elected by the wider population, that the committees should broadly reflect the composition of Parliament. So, you know, that would be my perspective on the matter. Yeah, but of course, you know, a smaller committee, you could argue that makes it more challenging because not every party can be represented. But you know, by its nature, that's down to the size of parties, and we try and reflect it across the allocation across all committees, I suppose. But again, it'd be a matter for Parliament to determine if that should change.
There is, at the moment, significant churn in membership of committees. What do you think drives that?
Well, different things. I mean, the most obvious and probably the most substantial single event that might drive it is if the First Minister, or any First Minister, determines that there should be a reshuffle, and some people should leave government and some people should come in to government. So, you know, clearly that would drive churn. But there are other things as well, you know, for good reason. You know, sometimes people are ill and have to take a leave of absence from Parliament, or issues of bereavement, other reasons that they might not be able to attend Parliament for a while. And of course Parliament has adapted its processes to try and accommodate that so it doesn't impact on parliamentary proceedings with proxy voting, with remote voting. But given, you know, committees are looking at things in depth, you know, there's only so much that can do to assist proceedings there. So, you know, if people are not able to be here for a while, then that's going to inevitably lead to probably changes on committees. And I certainly know that's been the case this session.
Is churn something that should be ideally avoided?
I do think, well, again, probably frustratingly, you know, the government doesn't have a direct perspective on that, but I think probably looking at it objectively, I think most people would instinctively say yes, and as much as possible, because you want people to build up a certain level of expertise and understanding. Although it also has to be balanced, and maybe part of the other reason it drives churn is people will also want to have, you know, to broaden their experience and to understand different facets of parliamentary proceedings, of government activity. So there is also a degree to which people might want to move committee because they want to benefit by that. But yes, I think broadly speaking, most people would instinctively say yes, we should try and minimise it. But you know, there is a degree to which there's an inevitability about it over the lifetime of Parliament, and it's, you know, that's not new. That's been the case across my entire time in Parliament. Before I was a minister, I was on numerous committees.
Yeah. I suppose if government is the catalyst for much of the churn, though, maybe there should be more of an interest in what impact that actually has on the effectiveness of the committees.
Yes, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say, I suppose, you know, I've conceded that, you know, the one-off event of a reshuffle would, of course, end up in turnover, churn, whatever we might call it. I'm not as convinced that it's government activity in of itself that drives that. I'd be interested in the evidence to suggest it is the activity or business of government that particularly drives that as an issue.
One other point that came out of the last session is the opportunity that committees have to add extra time to their programme. Maybe they've got quite a lot of bills to get through or post-legislative scrutiny that they want to add onto a very busy timetable, and the limitations of the parliamentary week. Ross Greer did suggest that perhaps some chamber afternoons could be given over to committee business. I think he said every few weeks or every few months could be an option. Is there a position on that from the government?
No, there is not. That would be a matter for Parliament. What I would say is that I know there's been because I've heard that the perception that, you know, the government is making these great requirements of committees through its legislative programme, and you know, that makes it hard for committees to handle their workload. I have it in front of me. So the average number of government bills introduced per year, per session. In session 1 was 13, session 2 was 13, session 3 was 11, session 4 was 13, session 5 was 12, session 6 was 12. So I think the evidence would suggest that we are not burdening committees with lots of activity in a way that we didn't before. What I do know is that the average time to pass a government bill is much longer now than it was before. I should clarify, of course, this is our initial look. There might need to be some sense check of these figures, but in session 1, it took 145 days, calendar days, so not just sitting days, to pass a bill. This session it's taken 290, and what's driving that is stage 1. Stage 2 and stage 3 is broadly stable across all those sessions. Stage 1 is taking much longer. Stage 1 is not in the hands of government. Stage 1 is in the hands of the committees. So I don't know if that's something the committee is considering.
Question at stage 1 sits in the hands of the government.
Of course it does in terms of the legislation we introduce. I'm merely reflecting the fact that when I'm hearing it's the volume of legislation that's driving it.
I think it's also
the facts would point in a different direction.
It's also right to say that we're facing bills that have substantially more amendments coming forward.
Well, I'm happy to speak to that as well if you'd like.
I am very conscious of time and indeed many people's commitment here to be somewhere else in the not too distant.
Well, if I could just quickly pick up on that point, the average number of amendments per bill per session in year 1, when we were getting through it much quicker, was 193. This session we're sitting at 140.
Do you have numbers there on how much subordinate legislation has been handed to committees in the different sessions?
I do, if you let me find it. Yeah, the annual volumes of SSIs in our first session was 326. It peaked. Sorry, the first parliamentary year for 2000-2001, it peaked in 2006-07 of 522. The last year we have figures for was 23-24. It was 193 SSIs. So again, I would respectfully suggest we are not overburdening committees with legislation in either its primary or secondary form.
Would you recognise that legislation that has come forward this session is not evenly spread amongst the committees, appreciating that the government doesn't set the issues that the committee remits sit in? And do you see an advantage in there being the option for bill committees that take the work of a particular bill out of?
I mean, there could be, and that is something that's happened before. I would observe we only have so many people to comprise committees, so you could think, well, that reduces the pressure on a committee, but it might not reduce the pressure on the individuals who comprise the committees. And yes, I would absolutely recognise that there are some committees that are going to be more legislation intensive, but I would also say that is not new to this parliamentary session. That's always been the case.
Are there difficulties from a government perspective when the committee dealing with a bill is dealing with the bill that's out with its own remit?
I don't think it poses any challenges for the government, and I would observe it would be. I think what might happen, I think what that is a reference to probably is that a bill might touch the remit of more than one committee. I'm struggling to think of the time. It could be a matter of perspective, but I'm struggling to think of a time where it could be felt that a committee has dealt with a bill that is not within its remit at all.
Dog theft bill?
Dog theft bill is before the Justice Committee, isn't it?
It's been dealt with by Rural.
It's by Rural. Beg your pardon.
But
well, again, but I think that
should
makes,
be justice.
No, I think that makes the point, though. Well, that makes the point. So I've misremembered that. So you need to forgive me. But it touches on more than one committee's remit. Okay. And if I could make the point, what government will do, and ultimately is for Parliament to determine. Government obviously has a role. What we will do is we'll look across the range of committee business to try and make sure that that workload is being spread more evenly.
Sue, can I come back to you?
Back to me. Keep up. Right. In terms of, we've heard a lot about this, but in terms of the preferences on committee structure, right now they do mirror a lot of the ministerial portfolios. Do you think there could be a sort of balance between creating committee remits which have a manageable breadth in terms of the scope and further clarity on which committee each minister is accountable to? Because there is that cross-portfolio. I'm thinking of Mr Fairley at the moment with that connectivity and etc. And some of the education and skills go across both number of committees.
Yeah, well, I suppose in the instance of Jim Fairley, he reports to 2 Cabinet Secretaries, so they tend to be structured along the lines of Cabinet Secretaries. I think there is merit in that, although of course ministerial responsibilities change, so I don't think we'd suggest, although again it would be a matter for Parliament, but I don't think I detect any sense that this would be desirable.
Okay.
That each time there's changes in ministerial responsibility would fundamentally alter the committees that we have. I know that sometimes responsibilities and remit might adapt accordingly, but to a greater, larger extent, I think it's a bit of a moot point. Any minister can be called before any committee, and rightly so. So, whatever the responsibilities as identified or are invested in any individual committee, if they want to speak to a minister, then I'd be urging and expecting ministers to do that. I was before the Equalities Committee not so long ago, which might not be a committee you would expect the Minister for Parliamentary Business to go to.
I suspect you might be called to any of them with that. Cause it's,
well, there is that perspective as well.
And here in terms of practical terms, to support committees better balance that work between inquiries and bills. I know we had discussions when I was convener and in your current role in terms of managing those congested periods in terms of the legislative programme. What more might be possible to allow a bit more negotiation in that timetable for scrutiny? Or is there a...
Well, some of that, goes back to the point I just made. I'm not abrogating the responsibility for government to consider that, because if it's to do with legislation, we do introduce it at a certain stage, so we do need to consider that. And we do look across the range of activity in committees when thinking through how we might frame legislation. But once it's introduced into Parliament, it's not in the government's hands. Of course, we'll have a role. Our officials would be engaging with clerks of committees and, of course, the Parliament's business team to try and work through that process. But once it's in Parliament, it's in Parliament's hands in terms of timetabling.
We did hear from one of our witnesses that said maybe the committees could... What would happen if the committees just said no to something happening? How would the government feel if the committee was to exert that level of...
Well, I guess it would depend on the question. Certainly if we've introduced legislation, I think there'd be a wider expectation that Parliament then has to consider it. But once it's at committee, it's for committee to determine. Okay. I would go back. I'm not going to say read out all those figures again, because I do see the time.
Okay. But I have
provided evidence about numbers of bills, numbers of SSIs, and the length of time it's been taken now, with a reduced number, certainly of SSIs, by contrast to a larger number previously when they were dealt with much more quickly.
Yeah, okay. In terms of, we've also heard about perhaps allowing committees to meet at the same time as the Chamber in private, and some even not in private. It would be formal sessions, and how that could increase committee capacity and reduce some of that congestion. Do you think the government might be in a position to support something, or do you have a thought on that? It might mean you have to appear at committees at all time of the day.
So, I guess my first observation would be, and the convener knows this as well as I do, because he sits on the Bureau, so it's possible for a committee to ask for that dispensation just now. If it was to become routine, again, it would be a matter for Parliament to consider, you would have to weigh that against what might be happening in plenary session and the desire of committee members to take part in those proceedings too. So if it was to happen, again, it's not for government to say whether or not it would happen. A committee might need to consider how it collectively determines whether or not it would be desirable or possible to meet balanced against the desire of its members to take part in other proceedings.
Thank you, Sue. I suppose my last question, thank you for your time and indeed your patience this morning, Minister. If we look at the gender-sensitive audit, there is rightly great pressure to balance, even just simply on a gender basis. One of the challenges that we've heard a substantial amount of evidence about, and you've hinted at it as well, is that the size of a government dictates the availability of that government's backbenchers to facilitate all of the other parliamentary roles. Rightly, and I think Scotland would expect, that the current party operate a gender-balanced cabinet across the ministerial portfolios. How do we square that with the challenge that achieving the same in the Parliament becomes incredibly difficult, in the sense of even just setting, as is suggested, 40%, the simple numbers of people who fit the correct gender aren't there, and the challenge is firstly obviously occasioned by those that return to this place, and we had an interesting discussion with the parties about their responsibility, but once we are in this place and that pool is fixed, the gender balance of the Scottish Government does make it very much harder to achieve the same. Which should take priority? What's your view on that conundrum?
Well, it is a conundrum, and I don't think one should take precedence over the other. It's obviously at the First Minister's discretion to determine who he or she wishes to appoint to government. It has been the determination of the current First Minister and the two First Ministers previous to establish a gender-balanced cabinet. I think that's a good thing. I think it is held by most people that that's a good thing, because I think government should try and be representative as possible of the wider population. So too should Parliament be, and Parliament is not. And I'm not going to veer into politics too much, because I know that's not the nature of this session. But it becomes more difficult when, and it becomes particularly difficult when, for example, the government party has, how would I put it, I would avoid using the term heavy lifting, although I have said it out loud, as comprising its membership, its numbers comprise a more significant number of female members than other parties might do.
I genuinely think you're articulating it in a very honest way. There is a precedent, because the government the Parliament is created first, out of which a government will emerge. But the selection of that government then dictates the availability for other areas.
Of course.
And one of the challenges is that discussion between, and I use the shorthand, De Hoyt, and the available pool that's left. Is there anything that the government can, or indeed should do, in reflecting some of its decisions to facilitate an easier achievement of what, I genuinely think we all agree would produce a far better vehicle in which to, at committee level, scrutinise and things like that, at chamber level to do other things? Is there a responsibility on the government, I suppose, to perhaps face really hard questions, to allow others to face what the Scottish people want, what the gender-sensitive audit has suggested?
Well, I know you're not suggesting this outright, Convener, but that would potentially just conclude that there should be fewer women appointed to government. If that was the question, then my answer would be a straightforward no. But recognising...
Or shifting a De Hoyt balance in other areas of the Parliament so that other parties can pick up the slack the government can't fulfil.
Well, I think that goes back to the point I made earlier, that I think it is as important that our committees represent who's been returned here in terms of numbers per party, because that's what the people have determined. I mean, crudely, frankly, I think, and you've said, and I've not looked in detail as to what was said in the session before, but you've said other parties have made reference to their own efforts to make sure that they are more representative of the wider population. Crudely, that would be the best way of achieving better and more representative numbers in Parliament generally, and then comprising the committees.
Excellent. Minister, can I thank you, as always. If anything comes to mind from either ourselves or indeed yourself, we know how to reach out to each other. But can I thank you and can I thank your officials for their time this morning? And I will now close the public part of this meeting.